But on an individual level, I have not seen almost anything in my personal life that just spiritually wipes out people like this stuff.
Yeah.
Like, it is like ideological AIDS, man. It's not that I'm trying to counter it because I think it's the greatest threat in the world or something. I don't want to be sensationalist about it because I don't think we're on the verge of another Holocaust. But I do believe that people who are uniquely equipped to some degree to counter it should be. And I think it's so evil that I want to smother it in the crib.
Yeah.
I want to kill it before it grows up while it still can be stopped.
This is an interview I wish I didn't have to release. It's with a friend and fellow content creator who goes by the name Hitler Hated Christ. And if you're wondering why it would ever be necessary to interview someone with a pseudonym like that, you're right on track. Something is taking hold of the minds, hearts, and spirits of men across America and Europe right now. A reevaluation of history whose aim is to retell it. A dark inversion that turns truth into lies and lies into truth, that calls evil good and good evil. The goal? To resurrect Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany from the dead and try their blood-soaked program of tyranny one more time. If you've followed this channel for the past 18 months, you've heard me reference this many times. You may even have seen it in your own lives. What my guests and I describe in this conversation is real. The denialism is sophisticated, it's organized, and it's working on men who consider themselves Christians and pastors who I believe no longer deserve the title. Our intent here is straightforward, to build an affirmative case for the historical reality of the Holocaust, not to score points, not to call everyone a Nazi, to assemble the documents, the speeches, the diaries, and the photographs into a picture so clear that the memes don't survive contact with the evidence. I've linked 3 additional videos in the comments. One builds an outstanding scholarly case in an accessible format. 2 focus on debunking the specific memes and falsehoods you're most likely to encounter. These 3 videos are essential viewing for anyone who wants to help put a stop to this. I wish you didn't have to master this material. If you care about young men and the future of the church, I believe you do. The situation is urgent, it's acute, and it's worsening. One technical note before we begin. YouTube's automated content flagging system can't read context. It pattern matches on words. To keep this episode from being suppressed before anyone can see it, you'll hear a couple of brief audio bleeps over direct quotations from Hitler. Nothing has been removed from the conversation, only obscured for the algorithm. Here's my conversation with Hitler Hated Christ.
Yeah, like what we should be saying as Christians would be something more like, okay, guys who think that it was 300,000 and mainly typhus and starvation due to Allied bombing, and guys who think that it was 6 million and not a person less, and it was crematoriums and electric floors and Holocaust roller coasters,
lampshades,
and that kind of stuff. And okay, let's take both ends. You guys get together and convince me that you're right.
Yeah, let's hash it out.
And that's the Christian approach to history. Tell me what's right. You guys get together and convince me that you're right.
Yeah, let's hash it out.
And that's the Christian approach to history. Tell me what's right. You guys get together and convince me that you're right.
Yeah, let's hash it out.
And that's the Christian approach to history.
Hello and welcome to the Will Spencer Podcast. This is a weekly interview show where I sit down and talk with authors, thought leaders, and influencers who help us understand our changing world. New episodes release every Friday. My guest this week is Hitler Hated Christ. Hitler Hated Christ is a commentator whose X account, YouTube channel, and Substack focus on primary historical sources documenting Adolf Hitler's hostility toward Christ and Christianity. His project serves as a sustained counter to false narratives in emergent dissident political and online hyper-nationalist spaces that seek to rehabilitate or downplay National Socialism's anti-Christian core. HHC has a direct and combative style, operating against ideological possession in an effort to preserve the purity and peace of the Christian church. Hitler Hated Christ, welcome to the Will Spencer Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Will. I'm excited. I think we're going to have a really good time today.
I think so as well. And so for those of you who are watching who might not be familiar with my guest's work, he's anonymous. And so this episode, for those watching on YouTube, will just be split screen where you get to see me reacting and you get to see HHC's icon. So please enjoy that new style of presentation.
That's right. And I do want to point out, too, I am very reachable on X, and I am sort of pseudo-anonymous. So If you reach out to me on X and you have any questions, there's a good chance I'll probably also tell you who I am in real life. I just don't put it out there for every insane person on the internet to see generally. So
probably wise. Probably
right.
wise.
Yeah. I have a brand of dealing with people that are especially insane. So that's part of that.
Well, that's great, because that just leads me into the first question I have. How did you come to deal with insane people like this? Like, what was the road? This is a very niche and, of course, very relevant, tragically, a very relevant field of study. But how did you find your way into dealing with this niche topic and the particularly insane people?
Yeah. So thinking just sort of back in time. So somewhere between 2014 and 2016 time period, somewhere in that range, I started to become interested in dissident online politics. I've always been right-leaning, always been conservative. And back when sort of Gamergate time period happened, I started seeing a lot of things coming across in my different circles that I ran in, even a little bit before college, that were about Nazi Germany or about nationalism, or what has sort of become a racially identitarian populism that we've seen emerge on the right. And I got involved in some of these spaces, not so much because I was a real activist, but just because it seemed like the fun thing to do and the exciting thing to do for somebody that was, right-leaning at that time. And in that period, a lot of that was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a little sarcastic. It was kind of like the beginning of the own the libs era of politics.
Mm-hmm.
It was the, I had a Kekistan flag in 2016, 2017, if you're familiar with what that is in college.
Yeah.
And I was never under the impression, based on the guys I was hanging out with really early, I guess, that people were taking this particularly seriously, right? That this was that Nazism, that National Socialism as an ideology was something that people were trying to resurrect. It was more just a thing to make fun of liberals with, that everybody sort of understood and was in on the joke. And later in that period, that 2014, 2016 period, I started to encounter some guys that were really involved in the early dissident right. So I met some people both online and in person who were part of groups like Identity Europa, which then became American Identity Movement, and many of whom have now moved into groups like Patriot Front, if you're familiar. And through conversations with these guys, I sort of realized that there was a broad segment of this dissident right, sort of edgy space that was really animated by the internet, that really took a lot of this, the World War II revisionism and pro-Nazi perspective very seriously. Like they didn't believe it ironically, they really believed it authentically. And a lot of them were pulling things from history, from anywhere from the 50s all the way to the early 2000s, of people who had previously run white nationalist groups and organizations, some of which that I think you've actually talked about, Will, on your show covering the Black Sun book. And they were pulling those out and sort of repackaging them. There you go. He's got the book right there. He's ready.
Yep. That's right. That just lives on my desk now.
That's right. It's a good book. And so they were repackaging these sort of ideas related to revisionism and Hitler and Nazi Germany to present to a younger, more online audience in some of these circles. And there was sort of a great filtering in this time period where you saw more people go into the sort of white nationalist space. Oftentimes those guys would begin defending Nazi Germany, depending on the context and things like that. And what was interesting to me and what I observed was a lot of these guys were raised evangelical or just Christian broadly. Some guys were raised in the Catholic Church. Some of them were, became more radically traditional Catholics because of this process. It kind of drew them deeper into a form of Christianity that they felt was, I guess, more aligned with their view of history, right? And through these conversations that I was having, I guess in this time period, it would have been more like 2017, 2018 by that time, I was realizing that there was a disconnect between the theology and the Christianity that these guys claim to have, and they claim to be followers of Christ and walking with the Lord, and their political machinations and their perspectives on the 20th century. And so I had all kinds of arguments. I had probably hundreds of hours of in-person, online conversations and arguments with these guys, most of which I knew, their real names and everything, and these group chats and all these different different places. And so I started to kind of formulate arguments against this because I knew something was wrong here. I knew that what they were proposing regarding things like Nazi Germany were just not accurate, right? I was hearing not like they weren't calling Hitler a Christian prince, but I would hear people infer that Hitler was like the only real Christian leader of the 20th century type thing, or like one of the only real Christian leaders of the 20th century, that sort of thing. And it was all the same talking points that you may hear today of, well, the Jews are intrinsically depraved on a racial level, and that causes them to create the conditions of Weimar Germany. And so, therefore, Hitler and the Nazis' response to Weimar Germany was reasonable. And that has all just, their response to that was perverted by Jews after the war in such a way that they've lied to us about the immorality of Nazi Germany, and it was actually this truly Christian society that has been slandered for 80 years, right? That's kind of like the broad narrative that they presented. And the more I looked into these things, and we'll talk about some of the precursor stuff maybe in a minute, the ideology of Nazism, the more I found people that were just into the occult, were, blatant heretics. When I looked into Hitler's, specifically, I found all sorts of evidence that he was anti-Christian. And because I had all this information, I just had it for my own purposes, for my own conversations with these guys. I was collecting it for years and years and years. And then what happened when I created my Twitter account, which started off the brand Hitler Hated Christ years later, was that I saw some of these exact same arguments being repackaged, sometimes by guys who are claiming to be pastors, or online influencers that are claiming to be believers or Christians publicly, and trying to sell those things that have been laundered and repackaged to the body of Christ inside the church. Yeah. Claims about mocking or claims about the Holocaust not occurring, or mocking different aspects of the Holocaust, things like this. And that's when I was sort of activated to go ahead and make my Twitter account, because I was like, listen, I have all this information. I felt a little bit ahead of the curve on this because I had been dealing with it for years. And I decided to just make the account and start throwing up my research on X. At the time, it was Twitter before it got changed. And it got a lot of attention. It took off pretty quickly. I still have people that are adding or quote tweeting my stuff that I've posted all the way back in like 2023, because they get into some kind of conversation with somebody who's got Christ is King in their bio, and then they're claiming that all the Jews were lying about being mass murdered in World War II and that kind of thing, and so or claiming that Hitler was a Christian prince online and that sort of thing. So it's been relatively successful. It's kind of grown steadily over the last 2 or 3 years. And I've got more into the Holocaust side of things than I originally was, mainly because the same people that I had initially tracked that were making some excuses for just merely the ideology of Nazi Germany initially started to make excuses or deny the Holocaust occurring at all. And those could include figures like, I guess now would be like Michael Spangler, some of the guys out of like Ogden and Utah. So you've got Eric Kahn, and then also like Joel Webbon. Some of these guys kind of play in that space. And so I started highlighting some of the things that they were saying and putting up refutations. And just in this last January, I released, or I guess it was maybe late December, I released a really long 3-hour video refuting Holocaust denial that was pointed at Stone Choir and their World War II podcast episode, where they present a completely fictional vision of the first half of the 20th century, honestly, relating to Nazi Germany. So I know that was a lot of information, but that's kind of the route to how we got here and where I ended up in it.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And in fact, in a way, it's like you're kind of 5 years ahead of me in that curve. Like this, I went through something very similar. And I'll talk about that in a second. But before I do, I want to ask, what was it like for you? Because I can remember what it was like for me. Once you realized that like edgy jokes that everyone was just kind of like doing in the group chats suddenly started to become something much more dark and much more serious. Like, what was that moment like? Where it's like, we're just joking around, right, guys? Right, guys? Right? And when everything just kind of starts to go off the cliff.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of, I don't know if it was all at one point, but it was different things that I sort of noticed. And a lot of it really tied into the theological. So I remember, I can think of receiving, I think I was in a Telegram chat way back in the day. And I got a message from somebody that was one of these like pro-Crusader Deus Vult hype videos or whatever, right? And I was watching this video, and at this point I had kind of noticed how they were splicing in like SS troops and stuff with this. So it's like, some SS guys, and then you've got, these Christian Crusaders and how they were trying to show them both in the same light or whatever. And in the video, in the middle of the video, it was like, the premise of this hype video was that hate is a virtue. It was like hate of things that are of things that are evil is a virtue. And the remainder of the little montage was presenting basically, a hatred of things that I think are deserving of hatred, like severe sexual immorality in the culture. That's really the primary one.
Mm-hmm.
But also, Jewish people broadly, right? And really trying to kind of flip what I believe was the Sermon on the Mount, like on its head.
Mm-hmm.
And the focus of the what I consider propaganda was really kind of like reframing the Sermon on the Mount in such a way that these young guys who were professing to be Christians sort of felt that they were validated in whatever feelings they were having about whatever group of people at any given time. And I remember thinking like, wow, that's really perverse. And like, what is the limiting principle on this, right? What is if I'm allowed to hate people, then what is that? Who can I hate? Why can I hate them? And it's like, well, we can hate people that are evil. And it's like, well, I'm a Calvinist. I think I'm evil.
That's right.
Right. I think you're evil. I think, and so what is it? What does that mean?
No,
right.
I know what you mean.
Right. But I think we struggle against, spiritual powers and principalities and not necessarily flesh and blood. Right. But the whole thing was presented in such a way of, as flesh and blood as it possibly could be, like the race of the Jews. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, as I was seeing that, I saw some different guys that are involved in this and how it just kind of consumed their life. And in every conversation that you had with these guys, it would always devolve into complaining about Jews. It would be complaining about women, complaining about the economy broadly, but like as if it was boomers, right? Their parent, which a lot of times was how they like just their parents. So it didn't even have to be actual boomers, just anybody that happened to be a generation before them or before. And I just saw this like take hold of these guys, and I saw nothing but negative fruit from it. I saw guys that were moving their denominations if they were even in a church. Guys that I mentioned like might have been evangelical, and then they suddenly went radical traditional Catholic, and then suddenly they were schismatic Catholic because the normal Catholic Church wasn't enough. They had to be SSPX. They had to be Pseudo-Vaticanist because the Pope wasn't based enough, right? And all in the span of like a year. So just sort of radical confusion, radical levels of resentment, and all these talking points that I had been seeing for years and years and years. And so when I finally saw this stuff that I thought was so poisonous get repackaged and try to be resold through influencers and pastors and stuff, I was like, I gotta like fight some of this, at least at the level where I had already done a bunch of research into it. So
I can relate to a lot of that. My door was very different. I came in through the New Age world, and the New Age world is, of course, all about asking questions, questioning history. And so what's different is that they would never land in the Nazis were good, because like they still had kind of absorbed so many liberal presuppositions. So they could never actually get to the Nazis were the good guys. That was a new thing, or at least that was super, super fringe. And I think from within the New Age worldview, you could look at people who would say the Nazis were the good guys, like those guys are crazy, right? But it was still like, well, and the Holocaust was fake. The Nazis were bad guys, and the Holocaust was fake.
Oh, so really? That's weird.
Yeah,
I never even knew that. That's crazy. Very, very different sphere than I run in.
Yeah, very, very much so. Very much so. But like, because I had been marinating in Holocaust revisionism and denialism sort of in that New Age world, it didn't like the Big Lie podcast just sort of swam by my filters, because like I had already been living in that stuff for such a long time. So many of the memes that we're gonna talk about today is just like, that's just in the New Age world, but it never gets to the point where Hitler was a good guy, Hitler was a Christian Prince or any of that, or the Holocaust was a good thing. It never lands there, but it always does this blanket questioning of everything. And so, it's a very different doorway to enter in through. But like for me following 2020, everyone goes into the group chats, all the guys start hanging out, and then the memes and the stuff start coming into these, private spaces. And I just watched it peel guys off. Like I watched guys lose their minds between like 2021, 2023, like guys who I've talked about this many times, guys that were close friends of mine. One guy he even made me the godfather to his daughter. And I watched him lose his mind and start ranting with dark circles under his eyes on his Instagram page. And it's just such a bizarre thing to have seen, this infection spread into people starting in, 2020 to 2023, but you had seen it 5 years prior. And now I think more people in the general public, unfortunately, are seeing it happen all around them, even at the highest levels of podcastistan, as people are calling it, with like Tucker Carlson and stuff like that. And that's what gives this conversation and your material this sense of urgency, is that, whatever started, it started small in some ways, in fringe niche communities, maybe even before the internet, definitely before the internet, as Black Sun documents, but the internet sort of like turbocharged it. And you would think that all of the firewalls, all the social, cultural, political, religious firewalls would hold in place to stave off this mental infection, but it really hasn't. And now it's just, as I said in a presentation to the members of my church, it's like a forest fire that has broken containment. And so now being able to present information, actual solid factual information about what went on to defeat the meme culture that this forest fire that's spreading around the world is so crucial. So I'm grateful, for your path that led you into and out of this stuff. So it gave you the ability to have this wealth of information, because it's incredibly needed right now.
Thanks. Yeah. And it's been, I've definitely deep dived a lot of these topics more than I did even since just 2020. Because when you come into a public format where you're having these arguments and debates and stuff online, you want to be more equipped, you're more motivated than just like talking to your friends about it, I guess, to really prepare yourself. But one thing that, and maybe I'll mention this a little bit later too when we get into it, but one thing I've been shocked about is for all of the contention and all of the people, the online and a lot of these circles that assert things that turn out to be, in my opinion, misinformation or whatever, there isn't a lot of willingness to have open debate and discussion on these topics.
That's right.
Some of the people historically that have the knowledge to counter this stuff are temperamentally left-leaning, and so they're oftentimes much less willing to go into contentious, combative environments and deal with it. And at the same time, there are a lot of people on the right today that are pushing this sort of messaging, but don't want to submit to argument about it, to debate about it, because I think a lot of them really believe that it's not as relevant as the sort of meta narratives that they're attempting to build with their audiences. And they're afraid that if they get into a scenario where they can have a debate with someone, that they will lose their audience if they appear to be like profoundly ignorant on a specific topic. So that's something. Well, and a lot of them are, right, and we'll maybe get into some of that in detail later. It's in different specifics. But that's the big thing, is like I still am a huge proponent of let's have debates about these things. Let's have arguments about these things. I've got five or six people that have history PhDs in my DMs, and I can quickly hit them up for information. I got guys that are in Germany that scan documents for me and stuff. I can get whatever you need regarding these topics and present it in a way that can handle these things and answer these questions. But it doesn't seem like the people that are claiming to be the truth seekers on this really are willing to engage with that. And that's been probably the most frustrating part of this whole thing, is that trying to combat it is hard if your enemy doesn't even come to the table.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. No, we're just asking questions. Like, are you really just asking questions, or are you just, motivatedly seeking the answers that validate your worldview? Like, there's a big difference when you're interacting with someone who's genuinely curious and genuinely wants answers, because when they get the answers that are true, like, oh, I didn't know that. Okay, cool. Thank you for telling me, versus the resistance to looking at or accepting the reality of evidence that contradicts their narratives. And one of the things you and I talked about briefly before we started recording is, maybe people don't know this, the Holocaust denialism and revisionism world is incredibly sophisticated. This is not just a bunch of punters, having laughs on the internet. Like, this is a field that has been going on now for 80 years, where they've developed all kind of like archives of memes and disinformation that they can deploy at a moment's notice into people's ignorance to sort of fill that ignorance gap with false information. And once false information gets into someone's head, it's very difficult to get that out. And so it's almost like a rear guard action for a lot of people now. And I think that's why subjecting or not subjecting to debate is so important, because you don't even get the chance to unseat false information from someone's head.
Right. Yeah. And I have a lot of guys that, because one thing I do is I have a policy of keeping my direct messages on Twitter totally open. Yeah. And I allow message requests from anybody, and I will get people in my direct messages who don't have any sort of sympathies to whatever bizarre niche Nazi machinations there are on the internet, but they saw one meme about, I don't know, like there's wooden doors at Auschwitz, and that's why they can't gas people or something, and they'll message me, and a lot of them are authentic. A lot of them are like, hey, I don't know what to make of this. This is really crazy. And I could just quickly be like, hey, here's some documents that are work orders from Auschwitz that reference gas-tight doors. We know that they were purchasing them. This picture that you're showing in this little low-res JPEG that you've seen is not actually the door. This is this door somewhere else in the building. And they're like, oh, okay. And that's all. That's really all it takes. But if your brand is, asserting this sort of like false information to build a meta-narrative, you can't allow your audience to be exposed to that. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think we've seen more consistent debate on the topic, is because I think that sort of threatens what's being pushed on that level. But anyway, that's about as conspiratorial as I get. I'm usually kind of an anti-conspiracy guy.
Oh, absolutely. I think Lord willing, by the time this podcast comes out, I will have released my own video about chapter 14 of Black Sun, which is conspiracy beliefs in the New World Order. And I lay out very clearly, where the conspiracy world came from, with the originators of it, and Bill Cooper and David Icke, and what their worldview was. And they're the granddaddies that have fed into Joe Rogan and Alex Jones now. So that's that whole world. The whole world is rotten. But I wonder if you can speak quickly about the meta narrative. I don't want to get in, we've talked about this before, I don't want to get in a position where we're setting up the meta narrative only to knock it down. I want to establish an affirmative case instead, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But can you talk a little bit about what you mean by meta narrative broadly?
Yeah, so this is oftentimes summarized as, I guess, what guys would really sort of label as the post-war consensus idea. Right. And there are formulations of this that I think are actually kind of accurate, that are not worthy of like real harsh castigation or whatever. But one of the formulations of the post-war consensus idea is that, if not all, most of the depravity or issues morally that we see in the Western world today are the result of the West going to war with Nazi Germany, and that if we had never done that, we would have been in a much better position than we are today. And this is where you will get replies and sort of meme comments and stuff where people will say, well, at least we're not speaking German. So you'll see some sort of like, trans whatever the heck in some city for kids, or you know what I mean, some story time thing, or some other like LGBT parade, or some mass migrant crime issue, and the comments would be, well, at least we're not speaking German. And the implication of this is, if we had only not gone to war with Nazi Germany, or I guess in the case of that, allowed Nazi Germany to conquer the West, which is a little odd because a lot of these guys don't believe that the Nazis wanted world domination, which is kind of contradictory, but regardless. The idea is that even if they did, it would have been better than whatever happened, in the last 80 years. And so it's an ascribing of all of those things to World War II. And it leaves out, a lot of nuance related to things like communism and the Cold War and all these things. But that's the sort of broad thesis, is that we made these mistakes by going to war with Germany in the 40s. And if we had just not done that, everything would have been great. And we wouldn't have had all these issues with all these different groups that are causing problems or whatever in the world today. And that's the meta-narrative that I see being sold all over the place.
Yeah, I see that as well. So great. Well, let's get into the true narrative then. And before we do, then you and I have talked about this. I want to just set the stage. One of the for how I want to approach the conversation, just for the listeners. One of the things that I've observed is that the way that the Holocaust is spoken about, at least for the past 40 or so years, since I've been paying attention to my parts of the conversation, is that it's primarily framed through the lens of personal histories, sort of victimhood kind of narratives, right? It's very relational. It's very personal, and it's very much like look at these pictures of suffering, which is a completely valid way to approach it. However, after decades and decades of doing that, the story behind that gets left out, and the story behind that I tend to frame in terms of means, motive, and opportunity. If we're talking about a historic crime, the way that we establish guilt in any crime is means, motive, and opportunity, and that I think is the thing. That's the picture that isn't painted for how the Holocaust occurred. It's these terrible things happened. These people suffered. It was this great evil, and all of which is true. And then that's the end of the conversation. Versus like, well, let's actually have a conversation about how this nation, like what this government, these individuals, these people believed, and how they set the stage for what set the stage for the commission of this crime, how the crime was actually committed, and the attempts to cover it up. That conversation, I don't hear that. I hear a lot of holding up stories that are kind of burned into the cultural consciousness, which is a valid way of approaching it. But I think 40 years or even 80 years after the event, there are naturally a lot of questions about how did this actually go down, especially because it's part of our cultural conversation today. And I think that's also a set of valid questions to ask. So underneath the just asking questions, there is, as you said, some people say, I saw the wooden doors, right? There is some validity to it, even though what's lost in the fog is often painted in a false light. I think there is validity, okay, let's set aside, the pictures of suffering, and let's actually look at how this was done, because I think there are valuable lessons in there. So that's the direction that I want to approach this conversation from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, before I've got a document here I'll share in a second. We'll go through some stuff. But one of the things that I was a little bit annoyed by when I went to, this has been quite a few years now, but I went to the Holocaust Museum in D.C., and the presentation was really lacking in a spiritual characteristic. It was lacking in an understanding of what really made the Nazi ideology arise from these people that had been steeped in so many years of Christian tradition.
That's right.
And it sort of begins when you go to this museum, at least according to my recollection, it sort of begins with, and everybody really hated the Jews, and they because of false information, which was it felt very shallow to me. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I'll show here, and we can talk a little bit about, is Germany was steeped in theological liberalism at this stage in history. So before the Nazis took power, there was this really broad presumption in Nazi German theology of the inaccuracy of things like the New Testament, and the idea that the Old Testament itself was some sort of immoral ethos or immoral worldview, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll talk a little bit about that and how it influenced Hitler and some of the early Nazi thinkers.
Go for it.
All right.
Well, while you pull that up, I'm going to reach down. I'm going to grab a book.
Go for it.
Exactly what you're talking about is the book Nazi Ecology by Dr. Mark Musser. And he wrote this book specifically because he felt that a lot of the explanations of the Nazi motives were very, very shallow. And so he wrote a 500-page, essentially he was aiming to write a textbook, took him 10 years explaining the worldviews that fed into, that informed Nazi Germany thinking, if you want to call it that. So we'll talk about this book in a moment. So just discuss the document we're looking at right now.
Yeah. So this is just something I put together, but there's a few different citations in here. So the earliest period that I kind of break this down at is between 1908 and 1920. We see Hitler's hatred of Jews sort of begin to form in his youth, and he becomes more political radical over time. World War I is really central to his worldview regarding this, and we're going to look at a quotation from Mein Kampf in a second and how he relates that to Jews. But in his earliest speeches, we see Hitler teach or say he agrees with certain like kind of Marcionite ideas. Marcion was a very early Christian heretic who believed that Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, was an evil God, and that Jesus came to sort of replace him or defeat him in a weird way. And this is a heresy that sort of pops up all throughout history, but it's one of the oldest heresies.
It's back even today.
That's right, and it's appearing even today with certain people. So you can see it around in all kinds of places. But so in 1920, in a speech titled "Why Are We Anti-Semites?" So this is Hitler laying out. 1920 is very early. Why not just he is, but the ideological movement that he is pushing, which ultimately becomes the Nazi regime, consider themselves anti-Semitic. And he says, "You must excuse me that I first take the book called the Bible, of which I do not want to affirm that everything in it is absolutely accurate, for we know that the Jews worked very liberally with it." And this corresponds exactly with the liberal theological consensus in Germany at the time. There was this belief that the Bible itself was really just not a reliable source, that whatever we had now was completely alien to what it might have been originally. And you even see tinges of this show up with guys like Bonhoeffer and Barth, who were immersed in this liberal theology at the time. And I defend Bonhoeffer on some things, but I do think that even those guys were influenced by some of this, but especially Hitler was, as we can see here. He also called the Old Testament a frightful indictment against the Jewish race. Not only did the Bible teach that the Jews used deceit to supplant other races, Hitler claimed, but also Abraham even gave up his wife to Pharaoh so he could do business in Egypt. So Hitler was like, he knew, right, so he knew the Old Testament enough to try to reverse engineer it into like a racial Jewish narrative. Jews after Abraham's time have followed his immoral example, he continued. In Hitler's view, then Abraham was a wicked founding father who set the tone for Jewish life from that time forward. And that's Richard Weikart's book right there, that quotation.
That's okay. So that's quoting Weikart, but the Hitler quotes, those are from Mein Kampf?
No, that's from the actual speech itself.
Oh, okay. So
yeah.
Hitler delivered that in a speech in public, right?
Yes, in 1920. So pretty early on. Otto Wagner, who was a confidant of Hitler, remembered specifically in his memoirs that Hitler had a contempt for the Old Testament, and Otto was quoted as saying that he said that it was, quote, suffused with a materialistic ethos that is not our ethos. So there was this sort of distinction or this idea that the Jews were too attached not to the physical world but wealth and things like that, and so they were reading back that into the Old Testament. And this is why when you see later on in Nazi Germany, they had institutes that were doing things like rewriting the Bible to remove the Old Testament or reinterpret parts of the New in their translations. The reason for that was they were trying to make what they thought was in the text more evident about the Jewish God really being evil. And we see that most clearly with Rudolf Jung, who was an early Nazi thought leader. He stuck around and ended up in the regime. He states pretty clearly that that the God Yahweh is evil. So it has also associated these teachings, which constitute a revolt against Judaism and its spirit, with the Old Testament, the same Old Testament in which the Jewish spirit finds its purest expression. Further, it has equated the All-Father of the Savior with the Jewish God Yahweh. So Rudolf Jung specifically rejects the idea that the Father of Jesus is Yahweh. And then he goes on to, weirdly enough, also be against monotheism, calling belief in a single God a fraud. And at the end of this section, he says, quote, "But to continue to," here we go. In reference to the Old Testament, but to continue to preserve it within Protestantism as a canonical document after the 19th century is the consequence of religious and ecclesiastical paralysis. Jesus founded no church and no priesthood. He was instead the bitterest enemy of Yahweh's priests. And this guy's this is in 22. So this is actually, funnily enough, even after that Hitler speech, explaining why his movement was anti-Semitic. But Rudolf Jung is also considered an early Nazi thinker, and all this stuff is all throughout his beliefs.
Yeah, I think that's the part that people don't really understand so well, is that Hitler and the Nazis didn't suddenly just pop into existence in like 1933 or whatever. There was a long genealogy of ideas within Germany going back into the 1800s that fed into their worldview. And again, just a shout out to Dr. Mark Musser, who went excavating into those depths to understand, like, okay, what was the intellectual, spiritual ground that Hitler and the Nazis sprung up out of. And they're consistently nature worshiping in a manner of speaking, anti-Bible in terms of like a German theological liberalism, anti-miracles, and all for the purpose of rejecting the God of the Old Testament in particular, but also, there's a mischaracterization of the God of the New Testament as well, outside of the person of Christ. Can you talk a little bit about the Barmen Declaration as well? Because I think that's another, along with the Wannsee protocols, I believe they're called, and the Barmen Declaration. Those are two pretty important things that I think a lot of people don't really know about. Maybe we can get to Wannsee later, but since we're talking about scripture in particular, is it premature to talk about Barmen right now?
No, we can. A little bit. I don't have anything specifically related to it pulled up at the time, or right now. But the general consensus or the general breakdown that happened was the German Christian population broke down into two groups. There was the German Christian movement, which espoused something called positive Christianity, and then there were Christians that rejected that, and I just would consider those Christians.
Yes, the technical term is Christians.
And the Confessing Church was like a subsection of the people that rejected the German Christian movement. But the idea is that within positive Christianity, the Old Testament was viewed in kind of a semi-Marcionist fashion, kind of like we just read, inheriting some of that stuff by Rudolf Jung, and there were different pushes by the regime to try to promote positive Christianity because, in my opinion, they saw it as like kind of an off-ramp for traditional Christianity, which I think they thought of as a threat to their ideology in the long term. One of the things that's interesting, too, is that a lot of the most anti-Christian polemics that we do have access to come from SS programmatic writings and also programmatic writings that were written for the Hitler's Youth.
Yep.
So there was this sort of idea that over time, they were going to be able to slowly phase Christianity out on the basis of like raising up the next generation in something that they thought was kind of like a lesser version of Christianity's negative aspects, and then possibly ultimately kind of get rid of the label at all.
Yeah, the Germans were also heavily Darwinist. I did a video on the theory of evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution, and how it explicitly informed, some of the great genocides, all the great genocides of the 20th century, including the Nazis, including Soviet Russia, and including communist China. And so the promotion of Darwinism, I believe that's probably an area, area of specialty for Richard Weikart as well. Right. Explicit promotion of these anti-biblical ideas.
Right, and the Barmen Declaration, I believe, is 34, and so that was those were Christians standing up against the German Christian movement, a subsection of which would have been like positive Christians, basically. They always pick these terms that are vague enough or sound literally positive enough to be kind of like annoying to reference, because you're like, oh, what's wrong with positive Christianity?
Right.
It's kind of like BLM. What's wrong with Black Lives Matter?
That's right.
That kind of thing. But the Barmen Declaration included a few things, if I recall correctly, things about the Word of God being explicitly inerrant, or that like the source of revelation or truth in the church, claims about Christ being the only Lord in all aspects of life. I just pulled up the section here. Yeah, the state should not fulfill the task of the church and vice versa. So there was some stuff related to the government, but really the primary thing was elevating the Word of God, so elevating Scripture. And we can see, that some of those attempts from some of those institutes that I mentioned earlier to undermine that kind of factor into that as well, where if you have this infallible document that even the government can be accountable to, having your citizens hold to that if you're a totalitarian regime is a threat. It's a problem long term.
And that continues to be a problem today, but that's another conversation. Quickly, while we're on the subject, because I want to move a little bit further forward in time from the 1800s into the 1900s, where I know we're at 1922 with Hitler's speeches and Richard Jung as well. I just want to read the description of Mark Musser's book, Nazi Ecology, because this book goes into much greater detail about the intellectual and spiritual foundations of the Nazis and Germany leading up to it. So this is the back cover. This is the description on the back cover of the book. Just so people get a sense of what it's really about. So Nazi Ecology deconstructs the anti-Semitic historical background of the early German Green movement of the 19th century that was absorbed by National Socialism. So early German Green movement, sort of like a back to nature kind of thing, Volkishness, that was absorbed by National Socialism. While many have decried the industrial nature of the Holocaust, such views cannot explain the motive behind the greatest crime of the 20th century. That speaks exactly to this part of the conversation. What was the real motive, besides like bad information, right? Which is what you talked about when you visited the Holocaust Museum in D.C. Nazi racism was foreshadowed by the social Darwinism of German Romanticism in the 1800s that laid the ecological foundations for what is otherwise known today as environmentalism. So social Darwinism and German Romanticism laid the foundations for this kind of ecological worldview for what is known today as environmentalism. So the case that Mark Musser is making is that social Darwinism and German Romanticism out of pre-Nazi Germany is what forms the foundations of the modern-day environmentalist movement. So lefty environmentalists don't like this book very much. And then the last sentence is, Nazi Ecology explains why the Holocaust is best understood as a modernized form of human sacrifice, carried out under biological/ecological camouflage that is rooted in the sacrificial oak imagery of ancient paganism. So the case that Dr. Musser is making is that pre-Nazi Germany was not essentially Christian in an orthodox way. It had a growing pagan movement that was what informed the worldview that ultimately led to the Holocaust. It wasn't this faithful Christian nation that was carrying out Christian principles. German theological liberalism and this ecological thinking, this ecological Volkish back to nature thinking had shredded, Orthodox Christianity, and that is what allowed the Holocaust to occur and actually fostered it. And that's the case that Dr. Musser is making, I think ties into what you've been talking about just now with, Adolf Hitler's quotes and Richard Jung as well.
Right. Yeah. So the I highlight on my Substack and some of these other places. I have a super thread on my Substack where I just have tons of information specifically about Hitler's religious beliefs. But one of the things that comes up that he really shows, even though I don't actually think that Hitler, I wouldn't even call Hitler a neo-pagan. I think he kind of thought of himself as more of a rationalist, but he was pantheistic or panentheistic. So he did believe in the idea of nature and God as being almost one and the same. And he, there are quotations of him where he refers to nature as omnipotent or eternal. There are, he discussed how he wanted to replace a very specific cathedral with an observatory, because in his idea that, observing nature's rule was really the highest form of worship in a kind of a strange way. And this ties into some of the survival of the fittest, some of the eugenic stuff, which we'll talk about in a minute, some of the documents related to that. But yeah, specifically subbing God for nature in different contexts. He loved to do that. And so he talked about like the will of nature. Like, what is the will of nature? Well, the will of nature is for the superior man to conquer the inferior, right? And so that sort of context tied into how he viewed the Jews and how he viewed disabled individuals and things like that. And he even talked about like nature's law. And likening it to a sin, right? So all these things are tied up in that, the environmentalism, the German liberalism, all that stuff, and it just makes a really nasty soup. And a lot of that was out kind of broadly in the population. And what Hitler did when he was able to do is go out and kind of show the population, hey, I can take all these loose threads that have some popularity in these different places and tie them all together to make this thing. And at the same time, be inoffensive enough to Christians that were really not aware of the worldviews at play in their age, such that he could gain and gain power, right?
I think that's, you said a couple really important things in there. There's a tendency when talking about history to focus on the beliefs of individual men, like what did Hitler believe, and to totally ignore the ground that they're standing on. This idea that like Hitler came prepackaged with all these ideas and foisted them onto the German people for the first time. No, the groundwork was already laid, and as you said, he tied a bunch of threads together that were already there. That he sort of weaponized them and actualized them in this way. So it does ultimately come to a head in this individual man. But he wasn't the man who brought all these ideas to bear. They were already out there, and he brought them together in a unique way based on his personality. But that doesn't make him the central focus, the sort of demagogue in that way who gave the Germans the idea for the first time.
That's right, and I don't have the document here handy, but there is a quotation from Goebbels in one of his, I guess it was like his short books that I think he actually might have published, where he does talk about how National Socialism was like unthinkable outside of the person of Hitler. So you still have this real cultic kind of like what I believe is ultimately turned out to be like a death cult going on with Hitler. But the only reason he was able to rise to that level was because he did accurately look at the culture that he lived in and found some places where he could latch onto and be inoffensive in other areas to climb and win the approval of the population to be able to get power and ultimately do some of the things we're going to talk about in a minute.
I think there's a book by Erwin Lutzer called maybe Hitler's Compromises or something like that. Sort of ways that he's portrayed as this leader who just through the sheer force of his personality brought Germany to this place. But also, I would imagine that book kind of shows that he had political machinations they had to go through and compromises he had to make in his own way to bring together sort of a coalition. That's sort of a picture of him we don't often see.
Oh yeah.
Please dig into that if you can.
Yeah, and that's really true. And what's so interesting because I read a lot of Goebbels' diaries, the passages talking about Hitler and beliefs, and Rosenberg's diaries and all these guys, inner circle Nazis. And one of the things that I posted a while ago on my X was a document, I think it's from Himmler, complaining about how the laws forbidding abortion in Nazi Germany were currently being applied to the Polish people. And what's so funny is that the way that Himmler presents this in this document is as it's almost like he's trying to like purity test the other Nazi German leadership and Hitler because he's like talking about how we have no desire to preserve the Polish blood. Why do we forbid them from getting abortions, right?
Right.
And so there's this kind of internal, and if you get it, what's really freaky is when you get into these like more dissident right spaces, these real extreme ones, I guess you'd say. You start to hear these kind of conversations, like these really like, well, I would consider very unhinged, immoral conversations about things like, okay, well, abortion, do we really want to get rid of abortion? Because abortion really kind of helps, white people in the U.S. demographically, right?
Paging Margaret Sanger.
Yeah, exactly. You bring in Margaret Sanger and all these people. And the Nazis were going through this exact same thought process. They were having these exact same internal conversations and dialogue. And what's really funny is a lot, the conclusions I've kind of come to with a lot of these guys is that when I read through these documents, it's like they had their own little like weird dissident right group chat. I mean, these guys were fantasizing about the future, Aryan, Übermensch, diminutive Berlin as the whole thing was coming down around them, right? They like because it was this crazy fantasy possession that overtook them. And anyway, that what you just said a second ago made me think about how I've observed that.
And it would be an interesting study. We don't have time to do it here, but you can tell a lot about a man by his friends. And so I think if you read the writings of Goebbels and Himmler and Rosenberg and the people and Dietrich Eckart and people like that, the men that Hitler surrounded himself with, like his friends, Rudolf Hess, stuff like that, you could get a picture of who Hitler is. And that I think is another, again, talking about the ground that a figure is standing on, that gets completely lifted out in this drive to focus on a singular figure. Like, yes, absolutely do that. But once you expand the focus just a little bit, not just in terms of time, like go back to, say, the 1850s and kind of look at what German thinkers were talking about in the 1850s leading up to the 1920s, do that. But then also look at the people that Adolf Hitler surrounded himself with. And you start to get a real picture that we don't often get. I think maybe it's too complicated, maybe it's too involved, maybe no one's actually like written that book in that way, but it's hard to deny what actually happened in history once you take a much broader view, not even that much broader, like just slightly broader, like just from him to his inner circle, and from let's say the 1920s and 30s to like the 1890s, like just back it out that far and you can completely understand, like, no, this is exactly what happened.
Yeah, exactly. And I even tell people, I mean, I've talked to guys online that will say, Hitler didn't have any desire to like mass murder the Jews, or he didn't believe in some type of world domination. And this is where I get, a lot of these guys they just haven't read Mein Kampf. Or if they have, they're cursory read it, or they didn't think about it at the level that they should have. And so let's talk about that real quick as we kind of move into the mid 20s and then into the 30s. So let me share my screen again. All right, here we go. So Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in 24. It was published in 2024 to 26, laying out core ideas for his racial antisemitism and expansion eastward. So here are two quotes on top, and then another one on the bottom I'll read. Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the war, or even during the war, if 12 or 15,000 of these who were corrupting the nation had been forced to submit to poison gas, just as hundreds of thousands of our best German workers from every social stratum and from every trade and calling had to face it in the field, then the millions of sacrifices made at the front would not have been in vain. Mm-hmm. So in this passage, he's fantasizing about how the horrors of World War I that he experienced firsthand would not have happened or occurred if they had preemptively killed what I guess would, in his mind, amount to a small handful, 12, 15,000 people of that were, in his mind, the reason for World War I and ultimately, I think, the defeat of Germany. Mm-hmm. And I don't have this pulled up in front of me right now, but there was some, I believe that there was some retroactive research into World War I by the Nazis that were trying to look for more tangible ways to pin World War I on the Nazis, on the Jews once the Nazis took power, so they could use it kind of as a propaganda. Mm-hmm. And they failed to do that. So I think I mentioned that in my 3-hour Holocaust video with some sources. Yeah. And then the next one, or you want to go ahead and say something more?
Yeah, no, the one of the key points of what led into the establishment of Nazi Germany begins before Weimar. It actually starts with World War I and Germany's defeat there, and I believe they called it the Great Stab in the Back. Like, we would have won if we weren't stabbed in the back, exactly, from our own people, manipulated by Jews. That was how they told the story of their World War I defeat to themselves. And as opposed to, and so it falls into this gap, I think, in our modern American understanding of history, where we don't actually look at World War I at all. People don't have a good understanding of what actually went on there. We tend to focus on World War II, probably because there's more moving pictures footage of it than there is World War I. But we forget just how formative that war was to so many different trends that would come decades later. And so we don't even look at and understand, how did Germany understand its own defeat in World War I, and how did that feed into what would come later? Those questions, like, they just aren't asked to the degree I think they need to be.
Right, exactly right. And I mean, if you already have somebody that's a very prideful person, and we'll see in a second kind of how we show some of that with Hitler in a minute, just on another page of Mein Kampf. But if you already have an extremely prideful person, and then you tell them that they've lost, or they failed to defeat an inferior group, they have to come up with a reason for why that's the case.
That's right.
And the Jews fit the slot. That's really part of it. It's not the whole story, but it's definitely part of it. So this is another page in Mein Kampf. This is one that I usually reference if somebody has some doubts about Hitler desiring world domination. Yeah. On this planet of ours, human culture and civilization are indissolubly bound up with the presence of the Aryan. So
that's
there
right.
you go.
All the people who have been listening to my Black Sun series and hear the way that people try to understand the presence of like the explanation of the Aryan anthropology is a fascinating subject of where they
Yes.
derive those things from.
That's right, and it doesn't include the Poles or whoever.
That's right.
Yeah, very arbitrarily drawn lines here. But anyway, if he, meaning the Aryans, should be exterminated or subjugated, then the dark shroud of a new barbarian era would unfold the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So he's already kind of, presenting things as this is a fight to the death. Like if we lose, we're gonna get all killed, which we know is not what happened, but that's how it was presented. To undermine the existence of human culture by exterminating its founders and custodians. So they are the founders of human culture and the custodians of it. So he's ascribing almost the creation mandate to Aryans alone here, if you want to read that theologically, which is, I think, radically heretical. To undermine the existence of human culture by exterminating its founders and custodians would be an inexcusable crime in the eyes of those who believe the folk idea lies at the basis of human existence. Whoever would desire to raise a profane hand against that highest image of God, so now he's ranking within the Imago Dei and creating stratification, and the Aryans are up top, among his creatures would sin against the bountiful creator of this marvel and would collaborate in the expulsion from paradise. One of the things that Dr. Richard Wiechart here notes is you see like creator there is capital C for creator, and this is the English translation, and proper nouns or nouns period are capitalized in German. And so, but even in official Nazi translations of various documents and quotations from Hitler, nature was often capitalized as if it was a proper noun when translated into English, which is really funny because it was presenting nature almost in an elevated format on purpose in the propaganda when they did convert things to English themselves. Anyway,
that's German Romanticism, right?
Right.
The German Romanticism had a strong nature component to it, as did you mentioned in this quote the folk, and we sometimes hear that word in English today in political conversations as the Volk, and I wonder if you can speak about that for just a minute, because that Volkishness or Volkish thought that's having a resurgence now, particularly in Reformed Christian spaces around the subject of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I mean the folk. Volk and the folk really just mean the people, right? So it really corresponds to broad populism, but really like an ethnic, really strictly racial populism in some circles. He refers in like the next sentence. So hence the folk concept of the world is in profound accord with nature's will. So the folk concept of the world to him would be the idea of higher breeding, elevating your specific people group, extremely high affections for your people group over all other people groups, the idea that the individual is really serving at the behest of the folk, so there's a real disdain for individualism within this as well. That would be like one of their critiques of America or something, for instance. So it's kind of all tied up that, and then you have a lot of other proto-Nazi thinkers that really advocated for this idea of like the blood and soil, so that the land was tied up in this as well, that it wasn't just a people group that if they moved somewhere else would maintain these characteristics, and some of the interplay between the land and the blood, the people who lived there and the place, that sort of mystical tie is where you get some of the weird nature worship stuff as well. And also the Darwinism, because it fits in that, because if you're only the result of your environment, then that's how you get that that sort of inextricable, that link that you can't get rid of. Right.
That's what Dr. Musser talks about, is that blood and soil was ultimately a mystical doctrine, meaning that our people have superior blood because we spring from superior soil, that there's a mystical, powerful quality about the German land specifically, and the land is what gives our people the superior blood. It's a deep tie to nature here, nature's will, like tie to actual nature, not in like a create, like nature as a created sense, but nature as the highest thing. This is this is where we come from. This particularly special plot of nature is what makes us special. And I think that's an aspect of Blood and Soil that I think has gotten lost in a lot of the conversations, and it gets distorted to mean something that it doesn't. Something tends to mean something far more benign when people mention it today. It was not a benign theological concept to the Germans.
Exactly right. Yeah, and there is an active effort in some circles to rebrand this as meaning merely, if you think that certain people live certain places or want to live certain places or have a right to live certain places, that you believe in blood and soil, ethno-national. It's like, no, that's not really the case. Historically, this is a very mystical, very metaphysical assertion, and it is absolutely tied up in some neo-pagan propositions, some Darwinian propositions, and all you got to do is read some of the early guys that pioneered this stuff to find some of that stuff out. So,
and
anyway.
to the world domination point, I just want to show the cover page or the interior title page of Nazi Ecology. I'll hold it up to the camera. Can you turn off your screen share for just a second?
Yes, here you go.
Okay, so I'll hold it up to the camera. Hopefully you guys can see that. That's a picture of a stadium. This is again, you just open up, here's Nazi Ecology, there's the cover, you open it up, there's the, hopefully that's in focus, it is. And so I'll just read you the caption that's underneath the stadium photo. The Nuremberg Rally Stadium was modeled after the pagan altar of Pergamum that German archaeologists excavated from Turkey. When they began the excavation in 1878, the altar was embedded in a grove of oaks. The Greek god Zeus was otherwise known as the god of the oaks. In Revelation 2:13, the phrase Satan's throne is most probably a reference to the altar of Pergamum. And so just to speak about, like, the Nazis, they had a worldview, right? They had a defined worldview. They were consciously linking themselves back to Rome. This is another thing that isn't spoken about very often. This was how they understood themselves. We're not just Germany for the Germans and we just want a little bit of land that was taken from us in World War I. This was a world domination vision that they had. The Millennial Reich was a big part of what the Germans talked about and was embodied in their archaeology. They built buildings for this. And I think that just completely lost in terms of the discussion.
Absolutely, yeah. And he highlights that here, and just in this next section, in that same passage in Mein Kampf. So he goes, hence the full concept of the world is in profound accordance with nature's will because it restores the free play of the forces which will lead the race through stages of sustained reciprocal education towards a higher type. So he's actually kind of referencing evolution there a little bit, by the way. So he's talking about the free play of forces. He's talking about the weak dying and then the stronger coming out alive and continuing to breed until finally the best portion of mankind will possess the earth. And so this is like the best of the Aryans, by the way, here. This isn't like everybody. This is the Aryans only. And then of the Aryans, the ones that can survive, that don't get wiped out with, whatever. Until the best portion of mankind will possess the earth and will be free to work in every domain all over the world and even reach spheres that lie outside the earth. So again, he's fantasizing about space travel and like how the best of the best Aryans in the future are going to conquer the universe, right? Or the galaxy, whatever.
They're in galacticism. So this is where, what is that quote from again?
This is Mein Kampf. This is Mein Kampf. Yeah, this is the inexpurged edition. So this is one that you will often be recommended by guys who are saying that all the other versions are propaganda. This is one of the ones that they recommend as being actually accurately translated. This is the Stalag, but anyway.
I would love to. I don't know where to find a copy of that. I think it's really important for people to read, so you can read Hitler in his own words, unabridged. And I know I've gone looking for Mein Kampf on Amazon. I'm sure I've been added to some wonderful lists as a result of that.
Oh,
do you know where you can find a copy of that?
So archive.org has the unexpurged, which I hesitate to say because I'm not sure I recall exactly the date it was published, but I believe it was published like a year before even the war. So I'd have to double check. But it was published. It was taken out of Nazi Germany and then translated into English. And the idea was that the guy who translated it wanted to have an edition that was contemporary and accurate because he felt like there was too much actually propaganda the other direction going on with some of it.
It's important.
Yeah, but the original German is also available, and you can always find passages like this. Now with AI, guys, like, go crazy. Find these stuff. You can find this passage in the original German. Archive.org has all these different editions. Compare, contrast them. Go crazy. There's also the Stalag edition, which was produced, believe actually during the war, and that's kind of a more German propaganda version of the book. But it even still has a lot of stuff that's pretty radical and is fine to compare to if you want to.
That reminds me, the German conquering the galaxy reminds me a lot of like Francis Parker Yockey, and who has shown up. Michael Spangler retweeted him like an authoritarian.
Oh, right.
Imperium will plant its flag on the highest peaks, I believe, is a pretty close quote to what Yockey was saying. So because that's what he believed the Germans were doing, and that's what they thought they were doing.
Yeah. I mean, it's the whole thing. It's these just fantasies of grandeur, elevating the Volk idea, the race, and all these things. And he goes on. So I'll read this last section here because we have a couple things here before we get into more Mein Kampf in the next section. But we all feel that in the distant future, many may be faced with problems which can be solved only by a superior race of human beings. So he's almost like putting like a clock on this, where it's like, if we don't do this, we're going to face problems that we can't fix unless we have the best of the best Aryans, in charge of everything. A race destined to become master of all other peoples, and which will have at its disposal the means and resources of the whole world.
There it is.
So I don't know any other way to interpret that other than world domination. I've had people try to, and I can't think of any possible way to think of that other than world domination.
What was the context that Hitler was writing Mein Kampf in? I think you can obviously, like, has a manifesto quality. It's polemical, but at a certain point the words mean what they mean. Where was Hitler in his life? What was going on when he was writing this?
So he wrote it after the failed beer hall push. So this was like sort of early Nazi ideological or foundational ideological stuff that they were pushing. And the whole thing is sort of a polemic for what was called Lebensraum. So the idea of gaining more living space in the East, and we'll see kind of the effects of that as we get into some of the more documents related to the German expansion and the Holocaust in a little bit. So it's a kind of a combo of political manifesto, autobiography, and explaining like why he really hates the Jews and thinks that democracy is super flawed. And pretty much like kind of what you read there regarding the Aryans. That's like the best bit that sums it up, in my opinion.
And real quick, you did mention the gassing statement. Like you said, if we could have not been in World War I if we had just gassed, 12 to 15,000 people. That was right. In Mein Kampf as well, right?
Yes. Yep.
And so just to show that same gassing kind of motif was present long before the Holocaust. Again, I'm at the front piece of Nazi Ecology, just on page 9 of the book. I'll hold this up again, and people can see this. This is the cover of Der Stürmer magazine, 1927. You'll have to zoom in on this, and maybe I'll post a shot of it, and I'll clip it in later for those who want to zoom in. Here's the caption underneath. In 1927, the National Socialist tabloid Der Stürmer portrays the gassing of what was considered to be Jewish vermin in the crevices of an oak tree that was damaging its roots. Quote, and this is what it says in German: "When the vermin are dead, the German oak will flourish again." So there's the gassing motif present in two different places in the 1920s. So you have Mein Kampf and Der Stürmer. So is it so hard to believe that motif continued, again, a couple decades later? I don't think so.
Right. Yeah. And people have pointed out before too that, even the language that you see there, talking about them as, the undesirables, Jews, disabled people, people from like Polish backgrounds, the Slavs, the association of, viewing them as vermin with the types of ways they were executing them, right? With gas, like intended to kill lice, initially. And so it's very ironic that a lot of the denial talking points that you may hear today are, they were only killing like lice or something.
Right.
Like they weren't gassing people, they were only killing lice. And it's like, well, if you read their actual rhetoric, it's the way that they framed it was that they were doing that. They were
Mhm.
killing insects. That's how they viewed it. They thought these were lesser types. These were
Mhm.
people that were not in the highest image of God, as Hitler, references the Aryans there.
That's
So it was perfectly acceptable in their view, in order to establish the living space in the East, to clean out all these people, and it would do nothing but benefit mankind. That was,
Mhm.
I mean, on some level, people view this as like, oh my gosh, this is so cartoonishly evil. How can, you believe that? But it's like, man, like the naivety that we have today.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, you look at the 20th century and if you apply that same sort of standard of, oh, that's so cartoonish, man, there's so much evil stuff in the 20th century. And only by the grace of God did we really eliminate, or at least like largely in the West, crush a lot of that stuff. Now
Mhm.
there's residual parts of it that we're still dealing with today, and the left with some of the communist Bolshevik stuff, but even on the right we see some of this returning. And it's like, man, we were so blessed by God that we conquered some of this, and so to see it come up again, and then to be naive at the same time and think, oh, that's just cartoonish, there's no way that people can be that evil. They can, and they have been.
Mhm. Yeah, the
Historically.
problem with the Francis Fukuyama end of history meme is not so much that he came up with it, it's that people actually believed it.
That's right.
We made it, guys. We're done. We're good.
We
And
did
it's
it.
like, we made.
Yeah,
I
and
feel-
it strikes me a little bit of like the view of World War I before World War I is like the war to end all wars, and everything is like post-millennialism was really popular before World War I because the idea was that, oh, we're
Yeah.
coming out of it, everything's great. And that's not to say that necessarily post-millennialism is wrong, but when people get disconnected from the true, really total depravity of man, they can create excuses for their own ideological perversions.
Mhm.
And it's not that I think we're on the verge of a Holocaust in the United States in current
No.
year or something like that. But there are groups of people, both sides of the political spectrum, that I think really have their own form of naivety in believing that these sort of things that sound so comically evil to us today are things that nobody could ever believe, because we know they did.
That's right, and they were very real and very present. And so it's just going back to my thesis about how I wanted to approach this. We're 80 years on from World War II itself, and we're now 100 years on from some of the ideas that we're talking about. And I think time and comfort and technology and ease that we've been blessed by has sort of insulated us from these historical horrors, these realities that were very present to everyone just several generations before us. And so we think that it can't happen to us, or these aren't parts of us, or somehow we've reached the end of history, or we've evolved in some way beyond all of it. None of that is true at all. We are still absolutely capable of all of it. And I think the loss of many of these lessons is a tragedy, not just because it disconnects us from history, which has its own negative impact, but also disconnects us from ourselves. And as you say, the reality of total depravity. So it's like, oh, we don't need all of those teachings anymore. We've evolved beyond that. No, we absolutely have not. And I think we're seeing it come back around today.
Yep, I agree.
Mhm.
So let me tag in real quick. I have like one or two more quotes here
Yeah,
from
please.
Hitler and Mein Kampf stuff, just for the ideological framework, and then we could talk a little bit about what they started to do when he became chancellor in 1933.
Yep,
So,
yep.
let me share my screen again here. All right. Okay, so also for Mein Kampf, Hitler explained why the struggle was necessary and even beneficial for humans. So again, talking about the evolutionary framework a little bit here. If races at different levels mate, he claimed the offspring will be inferior to the higher parent. So, quote, it will later succumb in the struggle against the higher level. Such mating is contrary to the will of nature for a higher breeding of all life. He goes on to say, stronger must dominate and not blend with the weaker, thus sacrificing his own greatness. Only the born weakling can view this as cruel, but he, after all, is only weak and limited. Is a weak and limited man. For if this law did not prevail, talking about the law of nature and kind of like we talked about earlier, any conceivable higher development of organic living beings would be unthinkable. And this is also, I believe, where he uses the term sin to reference in that passage the idea of like a genetic degradation of man through, I guess, like race mixing or something like that, right?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. So if you see, you have very interesting people online laundering this idea of the idea of race mixing being a sin or against God's normative design or something like that. That kind of perks your ears up a little bit, especially when it's defended in very broad natural theology terms that can't be grounded in Scripture. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, real quick, we were talking earlier about this document that you're reading from. Can you make that available to people who'll be watching so they can download it and see these quotes for themselves?
Yeah,
Would that be okay?
absolutely.
Wonderful.
Sure
That'd
thing.
be great.
Most of what we've seen so far is actually comes from my Substack in like a super thread. But
Okay.
some of the more Holocaust related stuff that we'll get to in just a minute in these other documents that's further down is in this and then in my 3-hour Holocaust video. So I can put this whole document online.
Great. That'd be awesome.
During his time in Nuremberg Party Congress in 29, Hitler talked about, you can kind of read that there if you want to, because it's a little bit longer, but he sort of conjectured at the idea that Nordic or Aryan infanticide would theoretically be a good thing, and that if we killed 70 or 80% of all children, that this would ultimately help the race, basically. Really just crazy stuff, and this is 39-40, the Nuremberg Party Congress, when he started to do that under the cover of war, but he said it as early as 29, right? And that moves into the next thing we'll talk about here. So in 33, Hitler becomes chancellor. The Jew hatred stuff kind of moves from a rhetoric into state policy. And that same year, they passed the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases, which you can actually read the text of here. This is the original German and the translation down here at the bottom. The Reich government has passed the following law, which hereby is announced: a person who is hereditarily ill, and all the specifications there you can read. And then it defines these hereditary illnesses as including things like schizophrenia, manic depressive insanity, hereditary epilepsy, blindness, deafness, and actually even alcoholism, weirdly enough, is tacked on at the end. So it's somebody who has issues with alcohol can be classified under this. And the idea was that they were going to forcibly sterilize these people. And the specific subsection 12 here of that same law: if the court has finally decided on sterilization, it must also be carried out against the will of the person to be rendered sterile unless the latter alone filed the application. So the idea is in this law is that people could actually file to be sterilized and the state would pay for it. But that the court could say, hey, we think that you suffer from this disease or alcoholism or whatever, or blindness that will be passed on to your kids, so we're going to forcibly sterilize you. And this was the order of the day in terms of the pop psych, pop science push. This stuff was very normalized. You can read about, G.K. Chesterton wrote about, it wrote some polemics against eugenics in this period. It's not like the West as a whole, or the rest of the Western world was exempt from this either, but Germany really put it into practice and started performing, sterilization against people's will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this sort of runs counter to, at least we're not speaking German. It's maybe if we're all speaking German and you're being sterilized for some condition that you have, beyond your will, maybe that's not so good.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's, maybe you wouldn't be born at all, actually, if if we were all speaking German, because I don't know if your great-great-grandfather might have had some sort of illness that they diagnosed as hereditary. What's funny, too, is in this period, their understanding of what was and wasn't a hereditary disease was basically crap.
Right.
So there were a lot of people, too, that they might have presumed their kids would never have issues with this. Or, I mean, just thinking even about deafness there. We have people that are born deaf today that we, can help hear almost as good as people who are born hearing with cochlear implants and stuff. And it's man, you're just gonna sterilize these people. It's very hard to imagine how anybody could defend that within any sort of remotely Christian moral context. So
that's right. And I think a lot of people who are in favor of these ideas naturally have the idea, that wouldn't be me. That would never apply to me. I'm grade A specimen, and that of course, you're so sure about that, right?
You're the highest image of man. You're the guy that's going to be flying around between the planets, the spheres out there, like Hitler said. Of course,
that's
you
right. Yeah, it has a dark appeal, to I think, I don't know, at the risk of psychologizing it, I think it has an appeal to this sort of like inverse inferiority complex, in a way. It's like feeling deficient in some way. So that's a psychologically intolerable state. So it flips into this, no, I'm actually better than everybody else. I'm just being oppressed. I think it plays on some of those sentiments, the sort of fleshly, sinful sentiments.
Yeah, no, I mean, the pride thing is huge. It plays into the pride thing. And like a lot of things that are sins that are difficult to define, one thing I'll get into conversations with these guys that have been kind of sucked into some of this stuff. And one of the things they'll say is like, well, can you like define for me what I'm doing that's sinful? And it's like, well, it seems like you guys have a lot of pride. And by the fact that you don't, somebody doesn't react in a pretty drastically negative way to like the declaration that their genetic stock is the highest image of mankind, if somebody doesn't believe that's prideful, you can't really explain it to them because it's like how you, it really has, it's the Holy Spirit. You have to just be convicted of this on some level. You have to have a level of discernment that comes from the Holy Spirit to be able to tell like, yeah, that actually is really out there and really radically prideful.
Mm-hmm. My pastor and I were speaking about some of these issues, and he gave a great term. He's like, a lot of these men just aren't teachable. They're spiritually deformed in a particular way by this information, but they refuse to be teachable and I usually show up and with that shows up with me, and I say like they just don't listen. Like they're not listening. Like you need to listen to what I'm saying, and there's just this resistance. But I think a more precise diagnosis is a lot of men are just not teachable with these ideas, which is a real shame. Like I shared that Skokie, Illinois police press release today, and then of course you're familiar with some of the ideas, the way that these ideas are taking hold around unexpected populations. And it's like, these things can be spoken into with rationality and with scripture. Certainly not everyone's going to respond to scripture. Like unbelievers, like just, who consider themselves such aren't going to respond to scripture in the same way someone who calls himself a believer should. But people particularly men, they're not teachable around these issues. They don't actually want the information that contradicts their worldview. They don't want the answers. They want to be affirmed in whatever their emotional response is, whatever their worldview is, and they resist anything else that you give to them that's a clear fact, a clear statement, a clear worldview. They can't even see it or hear it.
Right. Yeah, and a good example of this, this goes well into the next point on here a little bit too. I'll share my screen again. Here we go. Is I will have conversations with some of these guys about who started the bombing campaigns in World War II that resulted in like city centers and stuff being bombed. So we're now at like about 35. So we have the Nuremberg laws stripping Jews of citizenship, pushing them out of German life. You have Kristallnacht, so these outbreaks of anti-German violence, or excuse me, anti-Jewish violence in 38. And then in 39, Germany invades Poland. And what I see. And this is actually around the same time as Action T4, which goes beyond just the sterilization, but the actual killing of disabled people. And I have a quotation from Goebbels' diary referencing this in a minute we'll get into. But regarding the idea of people being unteachable, I've shown this little timeline right here to quite a few different people who will reference things like Dresden as being, the Allies were horrifically evil for bombing Dresden and that kind of thing, which is a city in Germany. And I'll say, okay, let's say for granted, bombing city centers is immoral. Let's say that we come to the conclusion that under just war theory and the Christian moral framework that bombing cities is wrong. Do you agree then that Germany starting by bombing cities in Poland and then Warsaw being the biggest early one, do you think that them initiating that in World War II was wrong, that setting that standard was wrong? And we can also say that the Allies doing so later was wrong. But would you agree that setting that standard and initiating that as the expectation in the war was wrong? And I have so many guys that will make that case, and then they'll look at this graphic and they just either will stop responding to me, or that's really honestly that's the only response I've gotten is to just either stop responding, or we'll just begin to harp again on Dresden. Or other city bombing, or we'll even go and talk about the nuclear bombs dropped on Japan, which I actually personally believe were wrong to drop. But regardless, this is a good example of that, and so I do like showing that graphic to people for that reason.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Oh, I was just going to say, like, one of the books that's been informative for me is the book KL by Nicholas Waxman, which talks about the construction of the camps, that they weren't just summoned out of the air in like 1941. That Germany began building concentration camps as soon as Hitler came to power in 1933, and that these concentration camps were a well-established, according to Waxman's book KL, again, which is excellent, were well-established tools that many states around the world were already using, so that the camps were beginning to be set up in this time as well, again, for enemies of the state, which could take all kinds of vague and nondescript kind of forms. And so to your point right here, like, a lot of the groundwork was laid from the very beginning, again, going back to the 1920s and earlier. But as soon as the 1930s start showing up and Hitler comes to power, these discussions and this worldview begins taking shape in actual policy and actual form.
Right. And one of the things that I don't know if the document's in this thing that I'm showing you here, so I want to be able to reference it while I have it fresh in mind, but it is in my 3-hour Holocaust documentary, is a lot of this was definitely framed as like the people that they were going to be killing were enemies of the state. Not so much with the disabled people, because that was really just, they kind of just plainly talked about that, as he'll talk about as we'll show in a minute. But one of the ways to speak to people who say, well, they were only killing enemies of the state, is that we have these Einsatzgruppen reports where these soldiers in the East were going in villages and killing a bunch of people and in the civilian population, and they would have separate counts for communist sympathizers and Jews. So they would have like a total for the amount of Jews they killed and then the amount of communist sympathizers that they were killing, the collaborators, right? And so even in their own internal stuff, it was pretty obvious that they were recognizing that not all of the Jews were communist sympathizers, that they were killing them for really this other sort of Aryan supremacy reason, right? Like killing vermin or whatever is how they viewed it. But
that's right.
So let me go ahead. I'll show, this is an article on my Substack, which I had linked in that doc. Here we go. So we talked a little bit about the sterilization of the disabled earlier. This is a quotation from Joseph Goebbels in 1941 in his diary. We can talk actually a little bit more about how we know that's authentic in a minute, but
yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, we can get into that too. So in 1941, Joseph Goebbels with Buller, so this is the guy who was assigned to be in charge of the Action T4 program, which was an effort to, as he would say, liquidate or kill a lot of people who were born with hereditary diseases or were considered to be disabled to the degree that they were causing undue strain on the German infrastructure, right? So like if you had some sort of disease or something that was going to require attentive care for the rest of your life, the idea was that they were just going to kill you because it was just not worth it, and it was better for the Volk long term to just get rid of you. With Bowler, discussed the questions of the quiet liquidation. So he recognizes that it has to be quiet here. That's really interesting, huh?
Yeah.
Of the mentally ill, 40,000 are gone, 60,000 must still go. This is the size of an entire NFL football stadium, by the way.
Wow.
This is a hard but also necessary task, and it must now be done. Bowler is the right man for it. And so I have this is a scan from Goebbels' diary. This is a really interesting one because this is actually one of the handwritten microfiche that we have. And I want to say we even have in fact, I think this may be a scan of one of the actual original papers because we have this, I think, also on microfiche.
Can you zoom in on that? Is that option available?
Yeah, I can make it bigger for
you. Boom,
you.
there it is.
But this is available on my Substack, and you can go read this, and you can see here. So you can even see in the margin notes, you have Bowler, 80,000. People are trying stuff here. Yeah. So, and then in the same article, I have some explanations for how we know what he meant by liquidation. There's a propaganda film that was commissioned by Goebbels that refers to the mass murder of Poles by Bolsheviks as liquidation. So in their own propaganda, they were using this exact same terminology. And you can go watch that and hear them say liquidaron or whatever it is. And it's the same exact word that he's using in his personal writings, referencing killing all these disabled people. So, yeah, and you can guess here. So I've got 40 and 60,000, and so is this transcription. You can go read this cursive if you want and see if you can.
You're turning into a droid from Star Wars for a second. Your voice got all digital.
Oh no, am I better now?
You're better now, yeah. So
Okay.
just repeat what you just said.
Oh, I was just saying, one of the reasons I post the original documents like this is that you could see, like, somebody wrote in the margin here 80,000. Sometimes these are hard to read, so if you want to go in here and make your best guess for reading cursive in German, be my guest. And if you want to see if, because I had somebody point that out the other day, they're like, "Why did they write 80,000 in the margin and the transcription says 40 and 60?" I was like, "Well, it's because it's actually kind of hard to read his handwriting."
Yeah, exactly.
That's why I put it out there, so you could see that. So, and I believe that these are based on the typed transcriptions on the microfiche, and this is the original actual handwritten. So
let's talk about the Goebbels diaries for just a minute.
yeah, so the Goebbels diaries is a kind of long and interesting story. So David Irving, who's a revisionist historian, originally authenticated them, or was one of the earlier people to authenticate them, when they were discovered on these microfiche plates in the Soviet archives after the fall of the Soviet Union. So microfiche are teeny tiny. See if I can find a good picture of this. I pulled one up the other day when people were asking about it.
And I know why they were asking.
Right. Let me see if I can find some little bitty ones that are the same size as the Goebbels.
I mean, I know what it is. Like I grew up with some of that. I'm old enough to remember when microfiche was a thing. It's not really such a popular way to store information these days.
Yeah, I don't have a good picture here, but what you can see in these pictures, this is what they look like. But each one of these is the size of like your fingernail.
Yeah.
Right. So they're teeny tiny. And immediately following the war, we had some actual paper, the actual paper handwritten documents, and some of the transcribed ones, I believe, that were typed up, that were Goebbels' diary. So Goebbels kept a diary for many years. He had his assistants transcribe some of the pages from the handwritten texts, and then I believe later on he actually might have dictated to them to type up for him. And these had fallen into Western Allied hands, the original papers. And there was a question on their authenticity at the time because we didn't have like a ton of them. We had some of them, and I think they might have ended up actually even at the Hoover Institution in the States. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they discovered in the Soviet archives, Western researchers, unbeknownst, I believe, largely to the Soviet Union, that these were even in their archive, these containers of sealed microfiche boxes that contained these microfiche scans of these documents. And a lot of these overlapped with the paper documents that we had already gotten from, or we recovered after the war. The Western Allies did. So we like rejoined these two documents together, like 60 years after the war when the Soviet Union fell in the 90s, or 50 years rather. And David Irving, who's a renowned revisionist, went to the Soviet Union, and he said these are definitely authentic. They're undoubtedly authentic. I have a video of him holding up a little plate and talking about it on a news channel where he's like, these are definitely real. And he based his whole book on Goebbels on these diaries. You can go look at the bibliography for his book on Goebbels, and it's like, not even just every other one. It's like 75-80% of the citations in that book are directly from the diaries because it's just such a treasure trove. So a lot of the anti-Christian statements by Hitler that I have on my thread are corroborated or stated explicitly in these diaries because Goebbels attended the nightly table talk conversations with Hitler later in the war and also had just lots of personal conversation with Hitler. And so really outside of some extremely fringe spaces, these are not contested. And even historic revisionists like Irving and Mark Weber and some of these other guys don't doubt that these are real. And there's some pretty damning passages in these, not just regarding Hitler's theology, but also regarding the Holocaust, which are in my other document we'll look at in a minute. One of the things that we do, and I like this example to explain how we know these are authentic. One of the claims that people have made because they hear, okay, we discovered these documents, these microfiche in the Soviet archives. I don't trust the Soviets. These guys don't trust the Soviets either. How do we know that these are real? Well, one of the reasons is that Goebbels records things that don't align with what the Soviet propaganda was at the time. So, for instance, in 1943, there's something that happened called the Katyn massacre, where the Soviets had killed a whole lot of innocent Polish prisoners on the Eastern Front. And the Germans actually discovered this mass grave, and Goebbels records that in his diary in 1943. He says, here near Smolensk, I can't pronounce, Smolensk, whatever.
Yeah.
Polish mass graves have been discovered. The Bolsheviks here have simply shot about 10,000 Polish prisoners, among them also civilian prisoners, bishops, intellectuals, artists, etc. What's kind of funny about this passage too is that this number gets inflated in the propaganda which follows. So it's pretty clear that Goebbels just straight up lies about the number. It's not that it makes it any better what the Soviets did, but it becomes clear that they were liars. And he goes on to talk about how they were fully aware that the Bolsheviks did this. And after the war, and these are the entries here. After the war, the Soviets denied that they were responsible for the Katyn massacre, and for decades and decades they denied it. And so it would be very odd for people who claim that we can't trust the Soviets because maybe they might have fabricated these diaries, for the Soviets to fabricate a diary that undermined their own propaganda regarding the massacre. That doesn't really make any sense. If they had this entire effort to try to blame the Germans for this killing of these Poles, why would they have written that Goebbels knew that the Bolsheviks had done it? Doesn't make a lot of sense. That's one of many, many things, including like a lot of corroborations of specific passages where Goebbels and Rosenberg, for instance, record the exact same or very, very similar, rather, statements by Hitler on the same days. Things that just don't make a lot of sense for fabricated documents or something like that. So,
I mean, leaving aside even that it would be incredibly difficult to fabricate microfiche. Like sealed microfiche. Like what kind of effort would be required to fabricate something like that 80 or more years ago? Like it'd just be
and that's really the argument primarily against the altering of it, because they could, if you think about it, they couldn't alter the tiny little microfiche that are the size of your pinky nail. There's no way they could do that. But what they could from like the beginning fabricate it. The only problem is, like you said, also sealed containers dated to the right period. No evidence that the Soviets knew most of these containers were even in the archive. They didn't use these various passages for propaganda either after the war, which again, I don't know what context they would have done that, but there's no indication that they even knew they had most of these. So there's a reason why these revisionists even accept the authenticity of those.
David Irving, he accepts the authenticity of them.
Right.
Like that's the thing. Is like, how can you, when the guy who found them, and built his career such as it is on top of the Goebbels diary, says that they're authentic, and he's the I guess the top scholar, if you want to call him that, of that entire worldview. You're kind of running into a conflict at the foundation of your own beliefs if you want to say no, David Irving was wrong. So you got to throw out him as well. And what are you left with after that?
Right. And he's kind of evolved in a really weird way where now you can find clips where he agrees that gassings were going on. He agrees that millions were being killed. Wow. He's kind of at the point now where the only thing Irving really, his contention is that Hitler knew about it. He kind of just has this idea that maybe Hitler, that Hitler just like was stupid and just was like, and funnily enough, like I could play a clip from our good friend Joel Webbon here in a minute if we want, but
please,
where he specifically references this idea that Irving ultimately had to conclude, because he, in my opinion, was just very biased in favor of Hitler, that Hitler must have had just no idea what was going on, despite what we just read in those passages of Mein Kampf and things like that. I can actually let me see if I can play
bring
that
it up.
clip real quick. So I won't play I have a longer refutation, but we're actually going to do that in real time in the document. But I'll play the beginning of this clip here.
Mm-hmm.
I think one, the atrocities that happened, I think that they were probably not as bad as we've been told, and two, the real atrocities, the things that happened that were valid or legitimate. Some of them may be directly tied to Hitler, but then some of them were probably also instances where Hitler was like, you need to banish these people. And then someone, close to Hitler was like, banish, wink, wink, and then they go off and, it's entirely plausible that he didn't even know.
Anyway.
Oh my goodness.
And then I play some stuff here that I'll show we can actually look at right now on this document, but that's David Irving's contention that he ultimately concluded at, was just merely that Hitler might not have known.
And that's, leaving aside Mein Kampf, leaving aside Hitler, Hitler's own writings, and leaving aside
Right.
that the guys right around him were calling for this and the ground was laid. Like, how profoundly ignorant would this man have to be?
Right.
Like, how could he be such a great leader if this was going on under his nose and he wasn't skeptical about people in his own government?
Right.
You're right.
And what's the motivation to presume this about a world leader?
Right. Yeah.
We would never extend. Yeah, we would never extend any of this sort of thinking. I can guarantee you that Webbon would never apply this to Donald Trump or Netanyahu today.
That's
I mean,
right.
there's just no way that we would assume that he had no idea that this was happening at the scale that it's happening. And I've got some stuff we'll show you in just a second. One from a speech, and then also one from Goebbels' diaries itself that make it very obvious that he knew.
That's right.
Anyway, so. Moving on here a little bit, so past the murder of the disabled and that Goebbels passage. In 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto was sealed. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were put into really horrible conditions in Warsaw. So Jews in the East especially, but all over, were forced into these ghetto conditions where they could concentrate them. Not really concentration camps, but different places inside cities that had very, very horrible conditions that were ultimately cleared out. A lot of these people were sent to extermination camps or concentration camps. In 41, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, mass shootings of Jewish men, women, and children began to spread across Europe. This is where you get things like the Einsatzgruppen reports, some of which I reference in my big Holocaust video. This is a really interesting document from 41 talking about this very specific ghetto. So it wasn't always just Jews. Sometimes they sent other types of people to these ghettos. But the Jewish ghettos were usually segregated as Jewish ones, particularly, even apart from things like people like gypsies. This is a government official writing to an SS, or actually I think it's writing to Himmler, addressing a planned transfer of Jews and gypsies to his ghetto. I must dutifully point out that under the current conditions in the Litzmannstadt ghetto, sorry, I don't even try. Further transfers, whether of Jews from the old Reich gypsies, are not possible. If the ghetto were purely an extermination ghetto, then one might consider the forced concentration of Jews, although even then it must be borne in mind that an outbreak of epidemics, which cannot be stopped in defense, yada yada. You can read the rest of that. But he basically says, like, one of the reasons we can't take them is because like all these people living here would mean that the people we actually care about, the German population, could get sick because we're just keeping them in these horrible conditions. But he states very clearly here that the ghetto could take more Jews if we were an extermination ghetto, but we're not. So please don't send us to Jews.
So there's a category of extermination ghetto. That is a category that exists in this man's mind.
Right. Yeah. And I don't laugh here because it's a funny thing that was happening. I'm laughing because it's just so unbelievably beyond the pale to read things like this and then just and to try to think how you have to the sort of mental gymnastics you have to go through to avoid what's obviously being stated in these kind of documents.
Well, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, and so many of these are just so benign too.
Yes.
I mean,
banal.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Yeah, I think we were speaking earlier about the sophistication of Holocaust denialism. Like, somewhere there lives on the internet someone who specifically put together a refutation of this document somehow, some sort of mental gymnastics approach to explaining why this doesn't mean what it very obviously means. But I think part of the problem, just going back to the very beginning of the conversation, is once you start putting together documents like these in a mosaic, and you look at a mosaic of the evidence, a picture starts emerging pretty clearly that, you might be able to pick apart a word here and there. And I know many denialists and revisionists do. You can pick apart this word, maybe it doesn't mean that, right? So but when you assemble all the documents and you assemble all the statements and you put it all together in one big picture, what happened is incredibly transparent. But that exercise is almost never done because the Holocaust is this thing that's assumed to have happened where the picture is painted of human suffering, which is very real and valid. But like when you actually look at the way that the men who carried this out and who orchestrated it and came up with the ideas, the way that they spoke about it, that the picture itself is undeniable. And that's the thing that I think needs to be built in the imagination that could actually be very powerful against people who otherwise may have even been brought up in a denialist framework.
Right, exactly right. And there's tools that you can use, I think, to explain this to people. I mean, I mentioned one earlier about that propaganda film that Goebbels even produced, where they used the word liquidation to refer to killing when talking about how the Bolsheviks were treating Poles and things like this. The Poles just got it from every end in this war. It was horrible. But anyway, but even I think it was a term like ausrouten, like to root out. There are other. I think the German Foreign Office translated an English document that was referencing the abuse of Jews, and they used that German term to refer to killing of Jews. They're in their own translations when they were translating like annihilate Jews into German from English. So there's examples of these individual words, but it really gets down to like I said a second ago. You've got to have motivations to try to dance around this stuff.
That's right.
Because it's so clear, and one of the reasons you don't see a lot of people out of Germany push this stuff, not just because of the social ramifications, but because when you can just read these in German, in the original language, it's very obvious what was being referenced. Whereas you can, when you pretend, to do your little translation tap dance, you can kind of try to get around it. And so that's why I tried to provide all the original stuff as best as I can for people who want to do that, so I can counter it at the level that they want to operate. But one of the things that's interesting is a lot of the I've had some interactions with these guys that are in Germany that are these neo-Nazi guys that they don't deny the Holocaust. Right. The neo-Nazi guys that I know that are in Germany don't seem to deny that the Holocaust occurred. They seem to think it did, and their contention is they just think it was a good thing. So I think that's interesting that the phenomenon of the denial itself of the event seems to be largely something that takes place overseas.
Yeah, this is the meta narrative point where it's like the influencers, podcasters, whatever, are trying to push this meta narrative, but they're trying to dance around what the meta narrative actually is. Like, they don't actually state in the sunlight, this is what I actually believe, and here's the meta narrative that I want to communicate to you. They're very slippery in terms of things that they talk about, instead of standing upright in the sunlight and saying, this is what I believe, this is what happened, or this is what didn't happen, and this is what I think should happen. They never say that. And it's that tap dance that becomes so insanely frustrating, because they squirrel out of the clear implications of their worldview. They squirrel out of clear contradictions to their worldview, instead of standing up like a man and saying, no, this is what I believe. And I would regard that for these hyper masculine types, that would be the truly manly thing to do. But that is the thing that they never do.
Right. I completely agree. And that's a source of a lot of my frustration. So
yes, we share that.
Yeah. So moving on here, just so we could kind of make our way through. 42, we had the Wannsee Conference. You referenced this earlier. This was a large conference internally in the Reich, where primarily it was a decision on what to do with the Jews, but with a lot of things as Germany was moving east into the living space of Lenzborough. The Holocaust is scaled up further through killing centers in occupied Poland, including Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and what we would generally broadly call now the extermination camps. And we'll get into some of the details on those in a minute. The Wannsee Conference helped coordinate the final solution across the Nazi state, and Goebbels' diary entries from these years reflect upon discussion regarding this. I'll mention that in a minute. This is a speech from February of that year that this conference took place, and these other entries we'll look at in a minute. This was written by Hitler, and then Adolf Wagner actually read it, I believe, at the Führer headquarters in February. So he wasn't there to read it, but this is what he wrote for him to read. And I highlighted a bit there at the bottom. My prophecy will be fulfilled, that this war will not destroy the Aryan, but instead it will exterminate the Jew. Whatever the struggle may bring, however long it may last, this will be its final result. And only then, after the elimination of these parasites, a long era of international understanding and therefore true peace will come over the suffering world. I love the little almost globalistic bow on top at the end, have lovely global international understanding. Well,
that's exactly what a lot of the post-war neo-Nazis actually believed. You talk about Yaki, you talk about Miguel Serrano, you talk about Spengler, you talk about a lot of these people. That's their worldview. Their worldview is that there's this culture parasitism, where as soon as we get rid of this group of people, the Aryan race will be allowed to survive, and not only survive but thrive. This is what neo-Nazis and fans of National Socialism and Hitler, this is what they believed after the war. Like, they didn't come up with these ideas whole cloth, and they were just carrying forward the very same ideas that Hitler and the Nazis had before and during the war. I think that's the really important part to people who want to say that, the Nazis were some sort of Christian regime, right? No, this is what they actually believed in their own words. And the people who followed immediately after, in the decades immediately after, that's what they believed as well, as opposed to thinking like, well, the Nazis were really Christians, but we were going to throw that Christian part out. We're going to do this instead. No, that's not what happened. They just carried on the very same beliefs that you see expressed in this document here.
Yeah, exactly right. That's completely true. That same year, so this is also February. This actually is a little bit before this speech, but it's the same month. The Fuhrer, this is Goebbels' diary. I have the scans for these. I don't think I put them in here, but I have the scans for these if you guys want them. The Fuhrer once again expressed his determination to clean up the Jews in Europe pitilessly. There must be no squeamish sentimentalism about it. The Jews have deserved the catastrophe that has now overtaken them. Their destruction will go hand in hand with the destruction of our enemies. We must hasten this process with cold ruthlessness. And in March of that same year, this is probably the most famous passage from this. If anybody tells you that they are a Holocaust revisionist and they don't know about this passage, they're not. They don't know what they're. It's just memes, because this is like one of the most well known. And this is one of the reasons there was such a split in the 90s with guys like David Cole and some of these other people who were revisionist and produced some of these documentaries that some of these guys online that you guys you may have seen. They left denialism because stuff like the Goebbels diary became so obvious what was going on.
Yeah.
The procedure, March 27th, 42. The procedure is a pretty barbaric one and not to be described here more definitely. Not much will remain of the Jews. On the whole of it, it can be said that about 60% of them will have to be liquidated, whereas only 40% can be used for forced labor.
Mm-hmm. That's the Goebbels diaries.
That's correct.
Yep. There it is.
And then the Wannsee Conference itself, and one of the things that people will dispute about this, by the way, is what does liquidated mean? It gets that silly. I mean, it's like, did this mean they were going to deport them? So
can we liquefied?
Right? You want to turn them into smoothies? Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe they did, but not. Yeah. Anyway, that would be the more
we're not
literal.
laughing because it's actually historically funny. We're laughing because of the ridiculousness of the ideas that spring up that say these things didn't happen.
Exactly. Wannsee Conference. So this is the conference that I referenced earlier. This is the notes from that. Under proper guidance, in the course of the final solution, the Jews are to be allocated for labor in the East. Able-bodied Jews, separated by sex, will be taken in large labor columns into these areas for road construction, during which undoubtedly a large number will drop out from natural attrition. So they recognize that the ones that they were working, I assume the ones obviously referenced here of the 40% to be used for forced labor that Goebbels references, were going to die anyway from either being worked to death or malnutrition or whatever.
Yeah.
Any final remnant that survives, since it will undoubtedly consist of the most resilient portion, will have to be treated accordingly, because it represents a natural selection and, if released, would be the seed of a new Jewish restoration or revival. So that's an interesting quote because it's like, it affirms that they were dying of crazy rates from natural attrition, which they knew about, and given other things like this that were worried about the diseases and stuff in these ghettos killing other, the general German population, we know that the conditions in these places was significantly worse than what the German population was experiencing. So it's not like everybody was dying like crazy at those rates at that point. Yeah. But they knew that the ones that they sent to work were going to die just from that process. And then they would have to treat accordingly the ones that survive the war, who couldn't be worked, basically. And whatever treated accordingly means, it would mean that they couldn't create a Jewish restoration in Europe.
Yeah.
So I wonder what that means, right? Seems pretty clear given all the evidence here, what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, and also just to keep people in the loop, like we've also talked about prior to these documents, the worldview, the Nazi worldview that led up to this. Like this is a continuity. This didn't spring out of nowhere in the 1930s and the 1940s. Like there was a long history of decades leading up that made this conceivable, possible, and then ultimately then actually to doing it, means, motive, and opportunity, right? So we've established, in many ways we've established the motive, right? And then we're establishing the opportunity of the crime, right? So they obviously the work camps and the ghettos, establish the opportunity. And so a lot of the meme questions, which I'm sure we'll get to around the wooden doors, comes to the means. What's the actual murder weapon that was used?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to establish a crime, that's what you need: means, motive, and opportunity. So we've established, we spent a lot of time establishing the motivation. We've established the German opportunity once the war began. And so now just the only question remaining, which I think was where a lot of revisionist and denialist kind of claims go, is around the weapon itself, how it was actually, the mechanics of how it was actually carried out. But just so far, we've looked at some damning evidence that say, no, this is what they actually believed. This is what they intended to do. This is what they had the opportunity to do. So now, how did they do it? And I think that's the part that isn't, for understandable reasons, that isn't talked about in such great detail, and sort of left in the fog because it's too horrific to think about. But these are the things that I think need to be thought about in order to unseat this meta-narrative worldview.
Right, exactly right. And again, I mentioned this earlier a little bit, but it's worthy of note too that there have been lots of revisionists who, throughout 80s and 90s, even early 2000s, that really pushed this idea of, the Holocaust didn't even occur. And those guys have just one by one conceded things like the Einsatzgruppen going around and shooting people.
Yeah.
Millions dead through just shootings alone in the East. And so when we get into some of the details of the ways that they were killing people in the camps, things like the gassings or whatever, and the mass cremations, these are really kind of like a subtopic of the occurrence of the Holocaust. The occurrence of the Holocaust is not in any way dependent upon the mechanisms that were being used in these specific camps,
right,
for body disposal or whatever else. There just isn't. That's kind of a misnomer that the Holocaust means only the gassing and mass cremation of Jews in these specific camps.
Exactly right.
And so what you do is you have people do is they present this kind of usually very ill-informed thing that is designed to call into question the mechanisms, and then based on that, then they reverse engineer and sort of subtly claim, okay, well then the Holocaust didn't happen at all. And it's no, I mean, and I don't have a lot of a lot of Einsatzgruppen reports in here in this page, but in my 3-hour video, I have some specific ones that talk about the counts and how they were shooting them, and that's very widely established.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, go ahead.
Real quick, you've mentioned this 3-hour video multiple times, and I just want to, I've watched the whole thing, and for those who are listening, I strongly recommend that you go and you watch that video. I think there's almost no topic that would be more important for those who are genuinely concerned what's happening in politics and with young men. There's no topic more important, as odd as that may sound, more important for people to understand than this subject about the historicity of the Holocaust. Believe it or not, as bizarre as that sounds, of all the things that we could possibly be spending our time on in current year to understand, I think this topic is central. So I definitely encourage people. Obviously, we're not going to have time to go through all of the evidence here, but it's really important that men and women who are concerned about this, they go and explore the evidence. And HHC, you've put together the most compelling compilation of evidence that I've seen, and the most comprehensible and thorough. And so I just want to encourage everyone, if you're enjoying this conversation, to go and watch that 3-hour documentary and not just take it for granted. Go and actually watch it, and then I think you'll see a lot of these things addressed in more depth that we can't go into right here.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you guys ever seen any of the denial talking points online, I mean, this video that I have, I mean, I address, I think, pretty much all of them. I mean, there's almost nothing that you're going to see online out in the wild that I don't handle in this video that I have found. And if you find something, please let me know, because I need to make another video.
Absolutely.
But this is my channel here, so @NotOurGuy on YouTube, and this is it. I re-uploaded it relatively recently, where I try to remaster some of the sound to be a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
But please do go watch this, and feel free to leave a comment and let me know if you guys have any questions, or my DMs on X are open as well. So I'm more than happy to get in there and chat with you about whatever you're dealing with.
And you also have the David Cole video, which you sent to me in summer 2024, which was like, one of my epic facepalm moments. Yeah, that first one where it's like just listening to David Cole, who made that infamous video about Auschwitz in the 1990s, listening to him work through all of the same, Holocaust denialist memes one by one. That's another really powerful one if people have more time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like, the guy made, Holocaust denial documentaries and then realized kind of what he had done later in his life. And I actually interact with him quite a bit on Twitter today, because I will have people still to this day send me clips from his documentary in the 90s, and I'll at him in there, and he will argue with these guys, and these guys will be like, well, no, did you watch the documentary? Look, he said the wooden doors. And he's like, I'm the guy in the documentary. I made the documentary. It's really a hoot. I mean, just the rhetoric of it all is just bananas. But
tag me in on one of those. I want to see that go down.
Oh yeah, I could probably send you some screenshots if you want.
Okay, please. Okay. Yeah, so let's get into some of these memes. Obviously, we won't have time to cover all of them, but we've established a bunch of different things. I don't want to belabor the point, but we kind of laid the groundwork for how something like this could have happened, both from an ideological perspective and a political perspective and a cultural perspective. So now let's get into like how it actually happened, to the extent that we can in a short time.
Right. So here is a 1942 document. I believe this is an Auschwitz document. I can double check the reference, but I believe this is an Auschwitz document. There were different camps that use these same mechanisms and terminologies. 1942 report describes the installation of 2 large ovens in the quote-unquote bathing installations for special actions. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So whatever the special action is requires a bathing installation. That's weird. The bathing installation for special action also required cremation ovens. That's interesting too. That's weird, right? So whatever the special action is requires you to be able to dispose of bodies and has something to do with bathing.
Yeah.
So that is really interesting, given people who were at these camps that said that they were told they were going to be given showers and then they were gassed and cremated. That seems to correspond exactly with those things. And there's that document right there. One of the other references we have to special action from this period, this is a doctor, an SS doctor. So talking about the banality of evil here. This is his diary. So on September 1st, he reports, rode off for Berlin on the officer's cap, yada, yada, yada. And he attended a block gassing with his Icon B against lice on September 1st. So this is how he describes an actual fumigation. What's so interesting about this is he actually is describing a real fumigation that was going on here on September 1st. And then in a later entry, funnily enough, he also records like his bowel movements and stuff in this, which is wild. But in September 5th, he records that he attended a special action from the women's concentration camps, actually of Muslims, which is really unique because they were killing Muslims as well. But there's some question on if this is referring to like gypsies too. There's some weird language overlap on that. The most dreadful of horrors. So whatever the special action was he attended on September 5th, he describes it as the most dreadful of horrors. That's a very different language than how he describes just a normal delousing of a block with Zyklon B. So something else is going on here. The Master of Orange was right when he called it the annus mundi. So he means like the anus of the world is what he references it. So he's using like the most graphically negative language to talk about what he had observed here.
Yeah.
In the evening towards 8, attended another special action from Holland. Because of the special actions, they, in reference to the soldiers, get a 5th liter of schnapps, 5 cigarettes, a bunch of salami and bread. And he says that they clamor to take part in such actions. So it's almost like he's inferring here that the soldiers want to take part in whatever the special action is because it means that they get extra rations. So if they participate in whatever the special action was, they get more commissary items. And very different language than how he refers to just a standard delousing of a block gassing, right?
Yeah.
So what is a special action? Well, we know it involves something to do with cremation ovens and quote-unquote bathing installations. if that's giving everybody an actual bath, why does it involve cremation ovens? If that's, cremating already dead bodies, why does he consider this to be so horrific? And why does, there's nothing that really makes sense of this other than what was pretty clearly going on.
Yeah.
As the killings continued, the Nazis also tried to destroy evidence by exhuming and burning bodies from mass graves. This is the Sonder Action 1005. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising also happened in this period and was crushed. There were around 300 to 400,000 Jews from the ghetto that ultimately died either within the ghetto or were sent to extermination camps. Most of those guys were sent to Auschwitz, I believe. Or those folks, rather. It's way more than just guys.
Yeah.
There's a memo from an SS officer, Herbert Strickner. This was a document that was analyzing the effects of the German occupation of Poland. And it notes here, the Polish people feel partly, so it's the Polish people as reference to the ethnic people, not the Jews in Poland. The Polish people feel partly because of these measures, in reference to the Jews in the context, and above all, because of the lack of German declarations about their future fate in the new Europe of the European Community of Nations, that they are excluded, and they fear, like the Jewish people, their ethnicity will be exterminated/destroyed. So there's a recognition in the general population, filtered through the Nazis themselves, that the extermination or destruction of the Polish people was taking place in Poland.
Unbelievable.
So
This is reminding me, like, when I actually started looking into this for myself, like, okay, let me see if I can understand this. I realized that it was actually far more horrible than I had really thought through. Like, it's as bad. I forget which book I was reading. I don't think it was Nazi Ecology or Black Sun. I'll have to think about which book it was. But as bad as I had heard it was, again, talking about the picture of suffering, the reality is truly so much worse. Like, it's truly like, it's disgusting is the only word that I can think about, that I can come up with right now, because that's how I'm feeling, is disgusted and horrified and revolted to actually look at history in the face. And you can understand, a couple different things. One is that why looking at something so difficult would have to be ultimately, it's incomprehensible to people, I think, largely. So you take a truly ghastly story and you attempt to tell it through individual suffering, which gives the individual watching a hook to kind of understand it. But also, like, I think this would just, to really look at these things in a concrete and clear way, would blow most people's circuits. To really look at these documents and see what they actually say. Any person with a living conscience, any person with any healthy sense of empathy, perhaps even an unhealthy sense of empathy, would just look at this and have it be like crushing to look into the eyes of. And so I can understand, in a sense, why it's like, well, we have to take these things and we have to put them into a form that will be comprehensible for most people to be able to endure it. And so I can understand and give the benefit of the doubt. And I think it's time that people start looking into the eyes of this and really beginning to reckon with it.
yeah, and one thing you mentioned earlier too about like the narrativization of it. For me, this stuff, you're right, is significantly more impactful than the individual stories.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly why that is, and maybe it's just the scale and the mechanization of it that's just so kind of horrifying. Whereas, we hear in the U.S. about individual murders and stuff all day long. It's all over. Half the TV shows are about investigating murders and understanding the psychology of individual murders and stuff. But when you have large groups and policies that are doing this sort of thing, it is harder to reconcile. It's harder to deal with.
Yeah.
And it's harder for deficient worldviews to explain.
Mhm.
Because individuals, you can say, are insane. Individuals, you can say, are mentally ill or deluded or whatever, and that may be the case. But when you get such a large operation of people, it's really very hard to make any argument against the reality of the spiritual sickness at hand.
Yeah.
And so if you have a worldview that's contingent upon that spiritual sickness not existing, you have to not believe this stuff. Like, you just don't have a choice.
Yeah. If you don't have a good doctrine of evil, I think that's been one of the big things that sort of happened from all this, is like kind of throwing out, oh, well, if God real, why bad thing happen, and so like I can understand, I can understand that, but at a certain point, if you throw God out, you really lack an ability to understand what evil is, so you sort of begin to undermine your own ability to perceive the horror of this. Because there's no redemption to it. It ultimately leads to nihilism, which of course it did for many people. Versus like if you have a good doctrine of God and you have a good doctrine of evil, then you can actually take a more or less sustained look at this stuff. Otherwise, you just have to kind of throw it out as madness or something like that prevents the actual encounter with it. So maybe the atheistic project sort of undermines itself as it would.
Absolutely.
Otherwise. Yeah,
1,000%. I totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just to kind of get deeper in this, so here's a 43 document. So we already talked about, special action involves cremation. Special action involves, what was it up here? Bathing installations, right? Okay, well now we have something that ties firmly gas to the cremation. So with crematorium 2, we acknowledge receipt of the telegram stating immediate shipment of 10 gas detectors. What's interesting is that you'll notice, I think in another document here in a minute, although I might not have included it, I definitely referenced it in that video, that a lot of this stuff is like with such urgency. So like they wanted to rapidly increase the cremation capacity. We needed immediate shipment of 10 gas detectors, right? Yeah. These things were premeditated, but they were also dealing with the scale as things were ramping up crazy fast. And we'll talk about the cremation capacities in a minute. But like this stuff was in these camps, they were having to adjust in real time to deal with these influxes of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And yeah, so this document affirms here that the crematoria were specifically receiving cyanide gas detectors, so designed to detect traces of prussic acid, so which is the base compound. So
wow,
that's weird. So what's the explanation for what this crema is?
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
We're running out of possible other things. Now here we go. So you might have heard. I think I have a higher resolution of this if you need it, but you might have heard the claim about there were wooden doors, so they couldn't have possibly gassed people in the crematorium in the Holocaust. Well, we have quite a few documents that reference how they were purchasing for construction gas-tight doors for the crematoriums. This one specifically had a spy hole made of 8mm glass with a rubber seal and metal fitting. I don't think I have a picture of this one in here, but we do actually have one of these doors, I think, that was recovered that has the protection grid on the outside of that spy hole, which is really weird. Why would you need that? And why would the protection grid need to be on the inside? Maybe, I sort of make a joke in my video, but like maybe they have really, really strong lice, and they were it doesn't make any sense. There's no other explanation for any of this stuff.
Yeah, I remember you putting that in the video, and just sort of undermines the entire picture of it's wooden doors, and you can't gas anyone with wooden doors. And of course, you explain in the video that wooden doors can be made airtight, and then you show a picture of the people, and it's like, it's so difficult to look at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Here's another gas tight door doc. This is Crema 4. Just referencing same thing, referencing gas tight doors again. And Crema, here we go. Cremation capacity. This is still 43. Total cremation capacity with 24-hour operations for the entire Auschwitz complex was 4,756 people. Boom, right there.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I point out in my video too, you may hear references to, they only had this many ovens. A lot of times what they are concluding by that when they see these sort of things, frankly, a lot of times you see memes about they didn't have enough ovens. They're just not even counting the ovens. They'll just say like, there were only 6 ovens, which is just fake. But ovens included multiple muffles. So I have some other documents too that reference this, but like there are multiple muffle ovens. So there are 8 muffle oven, etc. A muffle is a location in an oven where a body can be cremated. Mm-hmm. And we have even other documents that reference how you could overload these and do multiple corpses per muffle. So this is presumed, because there's accounts here, that this is likely even without overloading. And you're still talking about being able to get rid of 4,756 bodies a day at this whole complex, which is just an unbelievable amount of people. So
you just have to take a moment to I don't know the word, appreciate's not the word, but take a moment to kind of think about the level of insanity or commitment or whatever to carry out something like this at this scale. Like how far gone? And I don't mean to trivialize this and make it something, file it under the category of mental illness, because that's not what I mean. It's something much darker. But just what has taken hold of the German people or these individuals in general, whatever scale you want to look at, what has taken hold of people to produce a commitment to something so horrific? It's just it boggles the mind. It's incomprehensible.
Yeah, and it's a spiritual sickness, and it's also, like we saw the framing earlier in Mein Kampf, talking about like, well, if Aryans are exterminated from the earth, it's the end of mankind or whatever.
Yeah.
The whole thing was framed by Hitler and everybody, the propaganda machine, that they were told that they had to get rid of these Jews or else they were all gonna die.
That's
like
right.
The Jews, if any of these Jews left, they were gonna kill all of us. Which, regardless of how you feel about modern mass migration or whatever, and I'm in favor of an immigration moratorium,
Absolutely.
personally. But regardless of how you feel about modern policy and migration, the white genocide sort of rhetoric that you see today, it's very hard to not recognize as being reflected in some of this rhetoric of we are about to be killed. It's a self-preservation thing. There's nothing that you can, any reaction to a genocide is justified morally. Right.
Yep.
And so if you feel like you are being genocided, then you can do whatever is required to prevent that from happening. And I think that was what was that's the thought process consciously what was going on in the population of Germany, was that if we don't do this, they're going to kill us all. We've got to get rid of them. They're an infestation. They're a disease that's going to kill the body. We have to get rid of it.
Absolutely. And just, I want to mention Warrant for Genocide by Norman Cohn about the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And that document was referenced in Mein Kampf as formative to Hitler's worldview. And that's exactly what it says. The Jews are, committing genocide against the noble, proud white Aryan race or whatever. And so in all these complex and nefarious ways. So total war is being waged against us. And therefore we need to wage total war back. We have a warrant to commit genocide, which is where the title of the book comes from, and so therefore we now have the consent of our conscience to do these things. And as you say, it is a spiritual sickness, and there's no other way to understand it.
Absolutely. And just to reference something, because I want to be clear here, because I like to show both sides politically, things that are inconvenient with the Holocaust.
Yeah.
We talk about, I mentioned, modern claims about white genocide or whatever. The right obviously has some serious things that it has to reconcile with World War II, but so does the left. And so you may hear arguments of, okay, well, deportation of illegal aliens from Mexico or whatever. That this is the equivalent to the Holocaust in World War II by the left. You'll hear people on the left say that.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of my favorite documents. This is a little bit later than when we were out in the other document, but this is from 1944. This is Nazi German police. Explicitly stating, I can't make this image bigger. Here we go. That's big enough. That in view of the planned final solution to the European Jewish problem, there is still a ban on immigration for Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that they were just trying to deport them. They thought that they were such a threat that they needed to be killed. They needed to be eliminated.
Yeah.
And
that is not what's happening inside America.
No, it's not. And I love this document because it kills the narrative of, oh, they were all just deported from the right. And it also directly attacks the narrative from the left that like basic migration law operation is somehow akin to what they were doing in Nazi Germany, which was not the case.
That's right.
So we'll keep going here. This is Heinrich Kiene. This actually gets into the term liquidation. Like we talked about earlier, people may claim that doesn't mean kill. 1942, Heinrich Kiene was an SS officer in the Migration Central Office reporting on transports. Imbeciles, idiots, cripples, and sick people have to be removed from the camp, referencing Auschwitz, within a short time by liquidation to unburden the camp. So that's just matter of fact. Is that deportation? That's weird. Was there an island somewhere where all of the imbeciles, idiots, cripples, and sick people got sent? I don't know anywhere that would have happened.
Yeah.
Doesn't make a lot of sense to do that, to deport those people. But this measure has insofar complications as, according to the order from the RSHA, Rice Security Head Office, the Poles have to die of a natural death, contrary to the measures applied to the Jews.
Oof.
So whatever was going on with the Jews wasn't a natural measure or natural death. And it also resulted in at least a similar unburdening as the liquidation of these people up here. So, yeah.
I mean, the language is explicit. And again, going back, like you can, and I'm sure people do, pick at individual words, but when you assemble all these documents together and you put them together in a mosaic and you look at them for what they are, the picture becomes pretty clear.
Right. And this is a different document. I mentioned earlier the Sonderaktion 1005, which was to exhume corpses and cremate them. Now, they didn't do a great job of cremating them even after the Sonderaktion 1005. I have a really fast compilation in my video where I showed just like a ton of bodies and ash and stuff that they didn't cremate all of the bodies. Some bodies were partially cremated. They did a bad job. They didn't bury them well, whatever. But this sort of document or report was why they instituted ultimately that action to exhume bodies and burn them. So Daily Report 42 included in a war diary of a German military commander. Excuse me. Supreme Command Ostro informs that the Jews in Treblinka, different camp, are not adequately buried, and that, as a result, an unbearable body stench befouls the air.
Yeah.
So there was an issue with that they recognized. So this is a longer document. If you guys want, you can pause here and read this. It's in a little bit more detail. But it talks about specifically the crema and how the gassing cellar in the crematorium could be used temporarily while the morgue was being finished. So again, all these different implements are in the same building, which doesn't have any sort of explanation outside of, that they were gassing people, and then in the same apparatus they were also cremating them in mass. There's another special treatment document.
Real quick before we go on.
Go ahead.
Before we go on to we move off of Treblinka, I would like to share my screen for a second if I can. Let's see. I'm going to go back to. Thank you. I'm going to go back because I want to show a book that I found in my Defeating Holocaust Denialism Substack post. And let me see if I can share my screen. I'm going to share a photo. Let's see. Hopefully I can make this work. Maybe I can't right now. Window. Sorry, just talking my way through this. Okay. Let me know if you can see that. There it is. Okay. Into That Darkness, An Examination of Conscience, January 12, 1983, by Gita Sereny, Sereny, based on 70 hours of interviews with Fritz Stangl, Commandant of Treblinka, the largest of the Nazi extermination camps. This book bears the soul of a man who continually found ways to rationalize his role in Hitler's final solution. So this is with the Commandant of Treblinka, 70 hours of interviews. So I know that I believe in your Big Lie, you have a portion from Woe, from Stone Choir, talking about Treblinka. There was nothing found, all that. I think that was what you talked about. This is if you have questions about that, you can read Into That Darkness, and you can read with the Commandant of Treblinka. This book immediately came to mind when you covered that section.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, each camp. This is one of the things to point out here too. I don't have a map here, but there were 6 extermination camps in the East. There were a lot of concentration camps elsewhere. There are a lot of camps that are colloquially referred to as death camps. Yeah. Those distinctions have to do with at what stage in the war, what percentage of people and what groups are being killed at different times. There were all kinds of different methods of killing taking place across all of these different camps, and there's timelines for all of these different locations that you can find and look up.
Yeah.
So one of the claims that even guys like Joel Webbon have asserted before, is that all the extermination camps were discovered by the Soviets, and what they're doing is they're using a very specific definition of what an extermination camp is for Sobibor, Auschwitz, all these camps in the East, and applying that as if there were not mass murdering, there was not mass murdering going on at all these other locations as well, in a way to try to really deceive people into thinking that believing that the mass murder was going on was somehow merely like entirely a Soviet propaganda effort.
Yeah,
basically.
post hoc
Right.
propaganda. Yeah.
Right. And I mentioned in a video response to him, I think maybe in the document that I showed earlier, where there was that SS report during the war on how the Polish population was afraid of how they were going to be treated because, and the SS officer recognizes that the Jewish people were being exterminated or destroyed, right? So this is all stuff before the Bolsheviks came in that we have that shows what the policy was and what was going on. So, and then this is what I'll finish up this document with here. This document I've been sharing from here. This is Hans Frank. He's the head of the German government in German-occupied Poland in June of 1944. So this is pretty late in the process. He uses, you pay attention to the tenses here too. In order to fight the Jews, it was essential that we, referencing Germany, took Poland because here in Poland, the natural fertility of the Jewish people thrived or lived to a degree found nowhere else. There is a great map, actually. Let me find it real quick. I can find it real fast. That shows the total populations of Jews in different countries in Europe before World War II. Actually, as early as 1933, it says. Here we go. So when he talks about like the population of Jews, he's talking about in Poland, there were a lot of Jews in Poland. Sometimes you'll hear people online will say, oh, there weren't enough Jews in Germany for them to kill 6 million. How is it possible that they killed 6 million? Well, they don't understand the geography. They don't understand that all this was, Germany took all of this.
Yeah.
All of this on the left too. Yeah. So it is completely feasible that within this section of geography that there were more than enough Jews to find and kill 6 million. I mean, 9.5 million in Europe total as of 1933. And so when he's talking about this, he's talking about how it was important because the goal was to eliminate all the Jews, that they had to take Poland because that's where all the Jews were, right? Since the extermination of the Jews in Poland, so he's talking past tense even in 1944. That's how many they think they've killed at this point, in mid 1944. Since the extermination of the Jews in Poland, the Jewish future is completely over, purely in terms of blood or biologically. This is the term he uses, because it was only here where Jews were having many children. So it's just completely recognized, like they weren't deported. They were ended in terms of their. I don't know what terminology he could use here that would make it more clearly biological killing. So
it's and there's so many more graphic details that have been provided in other documents as well that's really hard to look at, and it's to think about how this was carried out. Like the coldness and the ruthlessness, I believe, was a quote from the Goebbels diaries that you referenced earlier. It really draws that into sharp focus, that these were not, these were not monsters, from some supernatural realm that were doing this. These were men. These were human beings that carried this out, and often for a few more cigarettes and rations that they clamored for. And, the idea of 30 pieces of silver comes to mind for what people can do for so little. It's a lot to look at.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe you can speak just briefly about the Einsatzgruppen, the action Reinhard camps. We've spoken a little bit about them and the SS as well and their role in all this.
Yeah, so let me pull up. This is an interesting document real quick here. So, I mean, Einsatzgruppen were like mobile military killing units. They killed, I think it was like somewhere around 1 million Jews in the Eastern territories. There's a specific document. These were SS, but the Wehrmacht, the General German Army, also participated with them.
And you have you have that clip at the end of the documentary of the Lithuanian man.
I do, yeah. I may take me a second to pull it up if you'd like to show that, but that guy was also Wehrmacht. I think he was not even German, though. I think he might have been drafted into the Wehrmacht. I forget what his nationality was, but
I'll refer people to your video so they can see that. It's quite a place to end the documentary on.
Here is a correspondence between Wehrmacht soldiers that were observing the or that they were aware of what was going on in the East with I believe the Einsatzgruppen or the Einsatzgruppen murders. Let me scroll my screen again here. Okay. What's interesting about this one is one of the things I've tried to highlight is that people talk about Hitler as a Christian prince or whatever, and we didn't get a lot into the Hitler's theology in this episode, but I have a whole lot related to that if we want to get to it.
You went robot for a second. You'll be back in a minute.
Oh, okay.
There you are. You're back now.
Better now. All right. I'm on Starlink, so maybe that's why I'm. It's transitioned to a different satellite. One of the reasons I like this document, and I like to talk about it in the context of people claiming that Hitler was a Christian prince, is that aside from all the evidence that I have that he wasn't, just based on all these different documents and accounts of his religious beliefs, his actions, spiritually scandalized his entire country to a just incredible degree.
Yeah.
You hear a lot of talk in these circles about, the soul of a people and all the blood and soil thing. And it's like, man, if you really believe that, what are you doing to the soul of the German people when you rile them up into such a version of themselves that commits this sort of evil? So this is Wehrmacht soldier Hans Aldrich writing to his friend during the war in 1942. Last night we sat and talked about things that make one ashamed to be German. What you hear here about how the quote-unquote chosen people, and I believe he actually puts those in quotes, are being treated, this has nothing to do with anti-Semitism anymore. So these are guys that bought into some extent of the probably self-preservation argument or propaganda argument, referring almost maybe even a little bit tongue-in-cheek to the chosen people here, and then also within quotes, and then also saying it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. We're like, anti-Semitism is fine, but whatever this is different, right?
Yeah.
It's inhumanity of a kind one should no longer believe possible in the 20th century, this quote-unquote enlightened modern era. How will we ever atone for this? Hearing such accounts, and here you hear them firsthand, makes one despair at the meaning of our fight. But what else is left for us? Shut up and continue to serve.
Yeah.
And the odds that somebody in the Wehrmacht at this stage of the war would have been killed is like just incredibly high too. Like the odds that both these guys died is like very high.
Mm-hmm.
And they were observing, they were hearing reports of firsthand that, as they say right there, what was going on, I believe, with the Einsatzgruppen in the East.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I wonder if you can talk for a minute about, you've compiled, this information over the course of, say, a decade or so, maybe a bit less, and you engage with these topics every single day on X. You've seen it in your private circles a decade ago, as we talked about, sort of the beginnings of the story of Hitler Hated Christ, and you've watched it grow from, a few private group chats to now essentially being talked about at some of the highest levels of American media today, almost definitely the highest levels. What has that been like for you? How, and as you make this such a passion project, what do you do to stay grounded amidst it? Like, what is your, I don't want to ask what is your theological perspective on it? How do you stay sane looking at such insanity every day on your feed?
Yeah, so that's a good question. This is something I've thought about more just recently. James White did a debate with Corey Mallor of Stone Choir, who's one of the largest proponents of the sort of barely rebranded neo-Nazism that's being pushed into some of these theological circles lately. And when he was talking about his prep for this debate and whether he'd do more debates or something in that context, he said, I can't do any more of these for the time being because it's just too spiritually oppressive.
Yeah.
And I feel that. I mean, I pray about it a lot. I probably pray about it more than anything else. I've been very blessed with a church where I've been able to be very open about the stuff that I do in this regard. There have been a couple instances, I can't go into a lot of detail, obviously, but
Yeah.
a couple instances of people in my church that have encountered this sort of thing tangentially. Either their son, in one case, in a family, son with divorced parents, another with an adopted daughter or adopted child. And one the other day of somebody that knew somebody for like 15, 20 years or more. And they just sort of got sucked into this sort of thing, and one day just kind of came out with it, just sort of like exploded out with this stuff to their friends and family. And they'll come to me and ask me like, what is going on? And I feel like I'm placed by God where I am to answer those questions, but it's not something I think that everybody's equipped to do. And I definitely have to ask for prayer for people, from people in my church. And I try to ask people to sort of keep me accountable online for these sort of things, because I do get frustrated when I see the amount of disinformation or the amount of people that are sort of willfully ignorant or pushing for things and beliefs and ideas that are so deeply evil without like a second thought. And it is hard to not become resentful, and be harsh and unkind to people online. Like if you talk to somebody that may be more bold than most, and just like agrees that the Holocaust was a good thing,
Yeah.
and you're trying to witness to this person, like, how do you be kind in that moment? That's really hard. And like, how do you love your enemies? It's like, well, you speak truth to your enemies. I want every single person that this stuff has hold of to come out of it. Somebody asked me the other day, they're like, "What do you think this is like the greatest threat to the church?" I'm like, no, I really don't. At scale, I don't think it is. But on an individual level, I have not seen almost anything in my personal life that just spiritually wipes out people like this stuff.
Yeah.
Like, it is like ideological AIDS, man.
Yeah.
And so it's not that I'm trying to counter it because I think it's the greatest threat in the world or something. I don't want to be sensationalist about it, because I don't think we're on the verge of another Holocaust. But I do believe that people who are uniquely equipped to some degree to counter it should be. And I think it's so evil that I want to smother it in the crib. I want to kill it before it grows up, while it's still can be stopped. So I understand, like, with the cultural context politically, you're not trying to be woke. You're not trying to go around calling everybody Nazis or whatever. I find myself in positions where I'm defending certain people that are more politically radical, but I don't think are neo-Nazis or whatever, on a pretty regular basis, to people online that are more left-leaning that may follow my content. But when we start to get into the real like rubber hits the road, can we just call evil stuff evil, man? We need people that are bold enough to speak out against that, regardless of if it's politically inconvenient. And you got to pray. You got to make sure you're in a church. I don't know how any single guys would ever do this. I mean, my wife is huge in terms of spiritual support for me dealing with this stuff. That's all I can say is, like, the body of Christ exists to support you through stuff like this, through pushing back against this sort of thing and doing research and learning it. But it's also not, not everybody needs to go out and become some sort of anti-Nazi apologist, right? I mean,
Right.
not everybody's temperamentally built for that. Not everybody's temperamentally built for, standing outside of abortion clinics and stuff, or whatever. Combating the acceptance of homosexuality into Christianity broadly, right? There are people that are uniquely equipped to deal with that kind of thing, and if you're equipped to deal with that kind of thing, I think that's probably God's calling. And make sure you have a church, and make sure that you have local accountability, and that you're not just sort of in an anonymous silo, because you could become resentful the other direction too.
Mm-hmm. I'd like you to speak to a couple different groups of people. So first, to young men or even young women now that might be caught up in this, that are listening to this podcast, and maybe their eyes and hearts are starting to open just a little bit. Where would you direct them to start, their own journey out, those efforts? And then also to people that are maybe hearing about some of this for the first time that aren't even aware of the denialists, and have received, the cultural picture of things and want to begin diving in a little deeper to have a deeper understanding of the Holocaust, of the Nazi ideology, where would you send them to begin? It's totally fair to reference your own content as well, but maybe in addition to that, works by others, books, perhaps videos that have blessed you and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, honestly, all of your Black Sun content is great. I think that for people that want to understand the ideological backbone of some of this stuff in history, that's really important to know within the context of the United States, which a lot of that book takes place with, picking up after the war. My content, I definitely would recommend to people. I have a 1-hour video that specifically addresses Corey Maller of Stonewire on Hitler being a Christian, and then that 3-hour video, which I put out more recently, about the Holocaust. If you have any specific questions, please do send me a message on X. I have a Substack where you can find my stuff as well. There is a blog called holocaustcontroversies.blogspot.com, which is a unbelievably solid resource for this sort of information, and that's obviously focused specifically on the Holocaust, but they contend with the denier stuff, and frankly, they contend with the denier stuff at a level that you're almost never likely to actually encounter in real life, because just, realistically, most of the deniers that you're ever going to meet are not people that are so committed to it that they go spend their whole life learning it. But this kind of blog is where these guys go to get countered, essentially. And then there's like a variety of different books. That Nazi Oaks book that you had recommended is really good. I don't have the reference off the top of my head right now, but there's a couple books that can really, walk you through. One of them's an expensive academic book, but it can walk you through how exactly we get to the estimated total death counts for the Holocaust. And it's really, it's extremely complicated. It's a combination of transportation logs and census data and all these different camps and everything. And if you are interested in that, you can definitely look into it. I will say though, like I said, for most things that you're going to run into, the denial is not even happening at the level where that's even necessary to have that kind of knowledge.
Right.
But if you feel led to look into that, please do. So there's also an individual by the name of Denying History. I think it's denying_history on X. He does a great job. I believe he's a credentialed historian, and I run like almost all the historical stuff I post about by him and DMs to just get either quotations checked or actual scans of documents and things like this. So if you want to get into that level of research, that's where I would point you. And like I said a second ago, my DMs on X are always open as well, and I'd love to talk with you. Even if you've had like a family member that's gotten into this junk or whatever, or whatever you're dealing with, I'd love to chat.
Well, brother, I'm so grateful for your work, for your thoroughness, for your discipline, for your consistency, and of course, your work has blessed me at many points as well. And so, I think everyone listening and watching can understand why and understand the value of the resources that you've put together and the value of the resource that you are in your commitment to this and your faithfulness. So I'm very thankful for you and for your work.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it, and likewise to you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think you've given everyone enough links to follow through, but if someone can only visit one link of yours, where would you like to send them?
Yeah, so I bought the domain. So if you go to hitlerhatedchrist.com, it'll send you directly to my Substack. So that's a good place to start. Also, my YouTube channel, like I mentioned, is @NotOurGuy. I have a lot of videos on there that are like cultural commentaries, often related to stuff like radicalization broadly, or kind of just a smattering of things. But if you're in these spaces online, you'll probably recognize quite a few of the things that I deal with and critique on that YouTube channel. So always trying to get more people pointed to that @NotOurGuy on YouTube as well.
Wonderful. We'll send people there. Thank you so much, brother. Again, I really appreciate all your work and this conversation as well.
Thank you.